Chapter 87. Who are you? What did you mean by that? At the poetry meet, exchanging pointers is a common thing. How is it shameless? If you don't give us an explanation today, I'm afraid we won't agree. Hearing that voice, all the scholars turned to look at the white-clothed girl standing there, their faces full of anger. To these proud and arrogant scholars, face was undoubtedly extremely important. To be called shameless by a woman, how could they tolerate it? If it wasn't for the fact that this girl was extremely beautiful, and they still had some pity in their hearts, it wouldn't have been as simple as a few questions. Shen Zhao's face darkened as well. As the second scholar of Qing and Prefecture, forcing a girl to compose a poem was indeed inappropriate. But he was used to being high and mighty. No matter what he said or what he did, countless people would agree. As for whether it was appropriate or inappropriate, Shen Zhao didn't care. But for someone to point it out like this, it was clearly not giving him face. Shen Zhao's eyes were cold. He looked at her and said, even though the scale of today's mid-autumn poetry meet is large, there are even more scholars in the prefectural city. I don't know how many scholars will not be able to participate. Since the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society have been invited to participate, your talents must be exceptional. If you can't come up with a decent poem, isn't that a bit unreasonable? Shameless is shameless. No matter how many excuses you find, it's still shameless. The woman's expression was still as cold as ever. She said bluntly, your literary talent isn't that great, but your skin is quite thick. You're making things difficult for a woman. Not to mention a genius. I'm afraid you're not even a man. As the top scholar of Qing and Prefecture, he was actually questioned by a girl about his literary talent and whether he was a man. No matter how good Shen Zhao's composure was, he almost couldn't control the anger in his heart. It took a long time for him to calm down. This girl's words also made these scholars speechless. To make things difficult for a girl like this, it was indeed disgraceful. But she actually said that Shen Zhao's literary talent wasn't that great. Perhaps even Yang Yinzhou wouldn't dare to say such a thing? It seemed that this woman did not know that the person standing in front of her was the second most talented scholar of Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao. Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo had no idea what these people were thinking. The two girls stared blankly at the woman holding the sword. They were extremely familiar with that beautiful face. It was exactly the same as the one in the painting. Please forgive me for my poor eyesight, but I wonder where you are from? Shen Zhao looked at the woman aggressively, anger clearly visible on his face. Since you look down on me, you must be much more talented than me. Why don't we compete during this poetry meet? If you can come up with a poem that surpasses me, I'll accept it wholeheartedly. Otherwise, I hope you can give me an explanation for today's matter. When Shen Zhao said those words, it was obvious that he wanted to challenge him. The meaning behind this was naturally not as simple as a spar. This kind of thing was not uncommon among scholars. Two scholars would compete in poetry, and the loser would have to admit that his talent was inferior to the other. For scholars who valued their reputation as much as their lives, this would be a stain that they would never be able to erase for the rest of their lives. Of course, the reason why Shen Zhao did this was because he did not believe that he would lose. The other was only a woman. How could she compare to him in terms of poetry? At this time, Wan Ruoqing quickly walked to the side of the white-clothed girl and hurriedly said, he is the second most talented scholar of Qing and Prefecture. He is extremely talented in poetry. Miss, please do not agree. Lu Rui naturally would not agree to a poetry competition with this Shun. She ignored Shen Zhao and looked indifferently at a certain figure in the back of the crowd. Everyone was puzzled when they saw this, and they looked in that direction as well. Being stared at by so many people, even if Li Yi wanted to watch the show, he could not continue. Moreover, his sister-in-law was about to be bullied. As the brother-in-law, it would be embarrassing for him not to stand out. Miss Ruoqing, Miss Zimo, what a coincidence, we meet again. Zheng Zimo greeted Wan Ruoqing with a smile and walked out from the crowd. The young prince Li Xian followed behind Li Yi. Seeing that he and the two girls seemed to know each other, his mind was filled with confusion. The last time the two went to the jadeite courtyard, he clearly did not know Zheng Zimo. How long had it been since then? How did the two of them hook up? Young master, Seeing him here, Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo's faces showed surprise. After a moment, the two seemed to think of something at the same time. They looked at each other, and then looked at Lu Rui. Could it be? An unbelievable guess surfaced in their minds. It's him! Someone in the crowd suddenly exclaimed. He is the talent who wrote Drinking Alone Under the Moon and Remembering Your Charm yesterday. At this time, someone finally recognized Li Yi. Just as Li Yi walked out, Su Wentian's expression changed and then darkened. It was because of this young man that he could not establish himself in his original circle and became the laughingstock of others. Su Wentian's hatred for him was already deep in his bones. He is the talent who wrote those 2 poems? At the back of the crowd, Yang Yinzhou and the talent with the surname, one showed a trace of surprise on their faces. Could it be that the great second talent of Qing and prefecture only knows how to bully women? Li Yi's lips twitched as he looked at Shen Zhao. Just now at the back, he had heard someone say that this guy was the second talent or something. It seemed like he was quite famous. Now, it seemed like this Shen Zhao's literary talent was still unknown. As for his character, TSK, seeing him look at Shen Zhao with a mocking expression, the eyes of the few talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society lit up. At this moment, Li Yi's image in their hearts was without a doubt even more glorious than before. At this moment, the way the talents looked at Li Yi was somewhat different. Everyone was very clear in their hearts that the young scholar had stepped forward at this time, and the meaning he wanted to express was very clear. Release those women. If you have any problems, come at me. Since he knew that Shen Zhao was the second talent of Qing and prefecture and still dared to speak to him like this, was he arrogant and conceited, or was he fearless? Of course, in the hearts of most people, they only felt that he was too arrogant. If the words just now were spoken by Yang Yinzhou, perhaps the crowd would not be so surprised. However, how could a nameless scholar compare to the famous Shen Zhao? Only an extremely small number of people with eyes knew that the person who could compose those 2 poems was also extremely talented. Even Shen Zhao might not be able to easily defeat him. At this moment, Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo's feelings were simply indescribable. Shock, surprise, joy, and a deep sense of disbelief. If their guess was correct, then no matter how talented Shen Zhao was in front of him, what could he amount to? Chapter 88. Even though the seats arranged for Wan Ruoqing and the others at the poetry meet were very remote and not easy to attract attention, ever since Shen Zhao brought these people over, many gazes were cast in this direction. Just now, when this unfamiliar scholar stood out and confronted Shen Zhao, the crowd began to discuss spiritedly. The crowd in the distance also finally realized that something seemed to have happened here, and more figures began to gather here. For people like me, exchanging pointers and poems is a common thing. There is no difference between talented men and women. I just wanted to see this lady's talent. What's wrong with that? There were already many people surrounding them. Shen Zhao's face recovered his gentle and refined expression as he countered with a question. Writing poems and lyrics are originally a way for scholars to cultivate their character and cultivate their character. It is not a tool for competing for power. To make things difficult for a woman like this is the behavior of a lowly person. It is not the behavior of a gentleman, Li Yi said faintly. Scholars usually boasted of themselves as gentlemen. To say, not the behavior of a gentleman, was already a great insult to them. No matter what, Shen Zhao was a person of status in Qing Prefecture. Just now, he was called shameless by a woman. Now he was called a lowly person. Ever since he became famous, when had he been humiliated like this? The refined expression on Shen Zhao's face had long disappeared. It was so dark that it was about to drip water. At this time, the way some people looked at Li Yi changed. Poetry was a way to cultivate one's character and cultivate one's character. It was not a tool for competing for power. Not to mention his talent in poetry, just this insight alone was better than many self-proclaimed scholars. Jingguo used his literary skills to become an official, which inevitably increased the utilitarian heart of the scholars. Over time, when it came to writing poems and lyrics, there would definitely be a difference in who was better and who was worse. The first and second scholars were actually fought out in this way. For this scholar to say such things, he was most likely a person with an indifferent temperament and no desire for fame and fortune. At this time, even those who were familiar with Xin Zhao couldn't help but look at him in a different light. Wan Ruoqing's beautiful eyes lit up. She had guessed correctly. Even though this gentleman was very talented, he was different from most scholars. He was truly a refined scholar with a noble heart. But when it came to money, forget it. Since he was a refined scholar, it wasn't a big deal to have some weird hobbies. It was precisely because of this that he was different from those people. Brother, since you have such a temperament, I'm sure your poetic talent isn't too bad either. I'm not talented, but I'd like to experience it for myself. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Xin Zhao no longer beat around the bush and spoke in an aggressive tone. At this point, there was no longer any room for negotiation. When there was a conflict between scholars, they naturally wouldn't fight with their fists like ordinary people. Whoever won would be in the right. Between them, it was popular to fight with words. The rights and wrongs of this matter had always been unclear. Even though Xin Zhao was indeed a little forceful, but this sort of thing was not uncommon in the circle of these scholars. Now that things had developed to this stage, no one cared about whether the cause was right or wrong. Once the two poems were brought out, it was clear who was better. If one's talent was not as good as the other, then one would naturally have to bow down to the other. Of course, the premise was that he would accept Xin Zhao's challenge. In reality, Li Yi was also considering this problem. For Xin Zhao to be called the second gifted scholar, he must have some talent. If Xin Zhao didn't come up with a poem that could suppress the situation, wouldn't he be at a disadvantage if Xin Zhao went back on his word? He didn't know many people here, so he wouldn't be at a disadvantage. However, he couldn't bear to bring out a really good poem. Those were all shining silver. Right now, Li Yi's career had just started, and he was in urgent need of silver. That kind of poem could be sold for at least a few hundred taels of silver. It wasn't worth it to just throw it out like that. Little Prince Li Xian tugged on Li Yi's sleeve and whispered, "Don't fall for it. Even though this fellow's character is bad, he is very talented." He was obviously on Li Yi's side, and didn't want Li Yi to be humiliated by Xin Zhao in public. Li Yi really didn't consider how talented Xin Zhao was. No matter how talented he was, could he be more talented than Li Bai or Su Shi? If he lost to a nobody like Xin Zhao in a poetry competition, Li Yi wouldn't have the face to meet these big shots in 100 years. No, he had to save face, and he couldn't take the loss. Li Yi decided to clarify things first. Therefore, while everyone was staring at him and waiting for his response, Li Yi quietly moved 2 steps towards Wan Ruoqing and whispered, "Miss Ruoqing, is there any reward for your poetry competition?" Reward? Wan Ruoqing was slightly stunned and looked at him with a puzzled expression. That is, if someone comes up with a good poem, just a few hundred taels of silver. Wan Ruoqing was stunned and raised her head to look at him. After confirming that Li Yi wasn't joking, she said with a headache, "No." Although the two of them purposely lowered their voices, everyone's attention was on Li Yi. Many people still heard their conversation. Realizing that this scholar was actually hesitating on this question, everyone couldn't help but look at each other. Their hearts were like 10,000 galloping horses. If he really beat Xin Zhao tonight, his fame would definitely spread throughout Qing'an Prefecture. At that time, he could casually write a poem, and there would be countless people fighting over it. Why would he be short of a few hundred taels of silver? Those top scholars, which one of them lacked these worldly possessions? Of course, Li Yi didn't understand the situation in their circle, so he didn't think about this. "You want me to come up with a good poem without money? Dream on." Just as he was about to open his mouth to refuse, Xin Zhao's expression changed. He suddenly pulled off a jade pendant from his waist and said coldly, "This jade pendant of mine is worth at least 300 taels of silver. If you win, this jade pendant is yours." Li Yi took the jade pendant from his hand and played with it for a while. He felt that the feel of this thing was not bad, but he still didn't have an accurate estimate of the value of this jade pendant. He casually handed it to Li Xian and asked, "Look, is this thing worth 300 taels of silver?" Seeing this scene, The corner of Shen Zhao's mouth twitched, and his fists tightened. The image of a scholarly scholar no longer existed. The expressions of the surrounding people were complicated. Their impression of this scholar was once again subverted. That Unfettered Poetry Club, how did they find such an eclectic talent? Wan Ruoqing rubbed her brows helplessly. Zhang Zimao's pretty face was stunned. The women of the Unfettered Poetry Society saw the gazes everyone was looking at them, and their faces couldn't help but blush. However, a glimmer of light flashed through Lu Ruoi's beautiful eyes. 300 taels of silver. It sounded like a good deal. After being appraised by the knowledgeable young Prince Li Xian, Shen Zhao didn't use a fake jade pendant to trick them. This meant that this deal could be done. Under the gazes of the crowd, Li Yi finally nodded. Since it is a competition, this place is naturally not suitable. Let's go over there. Shen Zhao looked at him coldly and led the way to the center of the crowd where the waterside pavilion was the most crowded. Su Wentian glanced at Li Yi with an extremely pleased expression, feeling extremely carefree in his heart as he hurriedly followed. He actually dared to compete with Shen Zhao. Tonight would be the night he would lose all face. When Shen Zhao and his group left in a grandiose manner, the surrounding people also looked at Li Yi with complicated expressions and quickly followed. Let's go over as well. Li Yi turned back to look at the people who were still standing in place. At this time, Wan Ruoqing bit her lip and suddenly raised her head to look at him. She asked, "We parted in a hurry yesterday. I still haven't asked for young master's name?" As soon as she finished speaking, Zhang Zimao also abruptly raised her head to look at Li Yi. An expression of extreme anticipation appeared on her pretty face. Zhao Yunru glanced at Wan Ruoqing and felt a bit anxious. Right now, they should be thinking about how to deal with Shen Zhao's provocation. This was not the time to ask these questions. Li Yi smiled and said, "This one is not asking for advice. This one is called Li Yi. Miss Ruoqing can directly call me by my name." Li Yi. Wan Ruoqing murmured these two words. Although she had already guessed it, she still couldn't believe it when she heard it from his own mouth. As expected, Zhang Zimao bit her lower lip tightly and looked at him with a complicated expression. All the doubts in her heart were completely resolved the moment she heard, "This one is called Li Yi." Chapter 89. Zhang Zimao now understood why he lost his composure when he heard her sing Celestial Magpie Bridge. It was because he was the one who wrote the poem. He probably didn't think that the poem written on the sky lantern would be picked up by Sister Ruoqing and spread throughout Qing'an Prefecture. Yesterday, he had been dismissive of Su Wentian's poems. With a wave of his hand, he had written 2 poems of a very high standard. Before this, no one knew that there was such a talent in Qing'an Fu. This made everyone very confused. All of this could be explained. This was because he was Li Yi, the one who wrote. If the love between 2 lovers lasts for a long time, why should they be together day and night? He was also the talent Li Yi that Sister Ruoqing, herself and countless women in Qing'an Prefecture yearned for. Li Yi. But the Li Yi who wrote, "If love lasts, why do we stay together day and night?" Zhao Yunru and the women of the Unfettered Poetry Society were dumbfounded. They murmured to themselves, stunned for a moment and still in disbelief. He was the most mysterious scholar in Qing'an Prefecture recently, the one whose celestial magpie bridge made Yang Yanzhou concede defeat. The one who made Shen Zhao declare that he would no longer compose qixi poems. The one who countless women, including themselves, wanted to meet. Zhao Yunru and the others' first reaction was disbelief. But when they thought of the 2 poems yesterday, they no longer had any doubts. In such a short amount of time, how could Qing'an Prefecture produce 2 talents who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao? So they were the same person. The young Prince Li Xian stood there in a daze. His expression was one of shock. Was this guy famous in Qing'an Prefecture? Why hadn't he heard of him before? What are you all standing there for? Li Yi looked at them with confusion. He shook his head and walked toward the water pavilion in the center. At this time, because of Shen Zhao, the water pavilion in the center had attracted the attention of countless people. Did you hear that young Master Shen is going to compete with someone in poetry today? What? Isn't young Master Shen the number 2 talent? Who else does he need to compete with? Could it be Yang Yanzhou? That doesn't seem to be the case. We'll know what's going on once we keep watching. How dare he compete with young Master Shun? Isn't he digging his own grave? Under Shun Zhao's deliberate efforts, the news quickly spread throughout the entire Mianxiu garden, and the crowd began to gather in that direction. When Wan were watching, Zheng Zumo and the woman from the Yunying Poetry Club walked over behind Li Yi. They were also shocked by such a scene. But when he thought of his poem, The Immortal at the Magpie Bridge, Xin Zhao no longer dared to compose any more qixi poems, and his heart immediately calmed down. Is that young master going to compete with young Master Shen? That young master is so handsome. This is a competition of literary talent, not who is good-looking. But he really is better looking than young Master Shun. It was not convenient for the women in the hall to get close, so they could only watch from afar. Occasionally, their voices could be heard. In the center of the waterside pavilion, in a spacious pavilion, Shun Zhao was already standing in front of a table. On the table was a brush, ink, paper and inkstone. His expression was calm and unreadable. At this moment, this place had already been surrounded by many scholars. As the second most talented scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, Shun Zhao was naturally a hot topic. The news of Shun Zhao's poetry competition tomorrow would definitely be the topic of conversation among the scholars of Qing'an Prefecture. Brother Yanzhou, Yang Yanzhou, and the scholar with the surname Wan were also in the crowd. Suddenly, a voice came from beside them. Looking back, they found it was a scholar they were familiar with. That person looked at Yang Yanzhou and asked in confusion, "Someone actually agreed to compete with Shun Zhao in poetry? Does he not know that in Qing'an Prefecture, Shun Zhao's poetry skills are second only to Brother Yanzhou's? This is a situation where he will definitely lose. Brother Yanzhou, what do you think about this?" Yang Yanzhou shook his head and said slowly, "Definitely lose? I don't think so." "Brother Yanzhou, what do you mean?" Yang Yanzhou actually didn't think Shun Zhao was optimistic. That person's expression froze. He had a faint premonition. Tonight, there would probably be big news. The surrounding people had been paying attention to the conversation between Yang Yanzhou and him. Hearing this, they immediately focused their attention and listened carefully. What if that person is the scholar who wrote, raising a cup to the bright moon, facing the shadows to form three people? After Yang Yanzhou said this, the surrounding crowd was silent for a moment. Then, they immediately burst into an uproar. It was also at this time that Li Yi and the others finally walked over. When they walked to the table beside Shun Zhao turned his head to look at him and said lightly, "Since it is the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, the two of us will use the Mid-Autumn Festival as the theme. We will each write a poem. As for who will win and who will lose, let the scholars here judge." Naturally, Li Yi had no objections to this. After Shun Zhao finished speaking, he already picked up his brush and began to write on the xian paper in front of him. His brush moved like dragons and snakes. Regardless of the content, it was full of vigor. A scholar came closer and stretched his head to take a look. His face involuntarily revealed an expression of envy. He murmured, as expected of the second scholar, "This new Mid-Autumn Festival poem is actually better than the one he just took out." After reading out Shun Zhao's unfinished poem in a low voice, the surrounding scholars all gasped in admiration. Shun Zhao's expression did not change, but he was very proud of himself. This poem was originally prepared to compete with Yang Yanzhou tonight. It was his hope of winning the title of the first scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. Naturally, the standard of this poem was not low. Shun Zhao had already written half a poem, but the scholar opposite him only picked up his brush. Someone walked closer, and when they stretched their head to take a look, they found that the xian paper in front of him was empty. There were no words. Could it be, he knows that he can't beat Shun Zhao, so he got cold feet? Just as everyone was having these suspicions, little did they know that at this moment, Li Yi was also in a bit of a dilemma. Just now, he had casually picked up his brush, and had forgotten that with his unique handwriting, no one present knew how to appreciate it. If he wrote it in this kind of situation, he was afraid that it would be embarrassing. After thinking about it, he made up his mind, dipped the brush in ink, and put the brush down. Very quickly, familiar handwriting appeared on the surface of the paper. Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo lowered their heads to look. After seeing the unique handwriting, they looked at each other and no longer had any doubts in their hearts. This handwriting was the same as the original manuscript of the Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. Other than him, which other scholar could write this? The young prince Li Xian looked down in confusion. His eyes suddenly widened, as if he had seen something inconceivable. Seeing that he had finally put down his brush, a moment later, someone couldn't resist his curiosity and came forward to take a look. Suddenly, an extremely shocked expression appeared on his face, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He raised his head to look at Li Yi, then looked at the handwriting on the paper with some uncertainty. Finally, his expression became strange. This handwriting. I'm afraid that only a child who has just learned how to write would be able to write this? Following that person's low murmur, a few more people came forward. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face changed slightly when she saw the change in everyone's expression. She immediately took a step forward, grabbed a piece of paper from the side table, and hurriedly began to write on it. A moment later, she looked at Li Yi again. After distinguishing the words and sentences, she started writing again on the paper raft. During this process, an indescribable expression gradually appeared on her pretty face as she looked at the words she had finished transcribing. When Li Yi stopped writing to check if he had missed anything, a piece of paper filled with hairpin-style small regular script had already been passed out of Wan Ruoqing's hands. Let's see what he has written. After seeing Li Yi's handwriting, the surrounding scholars began to doubt whether he had ever been educated. They smiled as they took the paper and looked at it. Shui Diao Getu. The first thing that entered their eyes were these 4 words. When will the moon be bright and clear? Holding a cup of wine, I asked the clear sky. Someone held the paper and read it softly. Not long after, the surrounding noise gradually quieted down. Chapter 90. Shui Diao Getu. Shui Diao Getu. I'm afraid no one will dare to compose a mid-autumn festival poem today. A blank expression appeared on the scholar's face. He had already been shaken by the paper raft in his hand. It's not just today. I'm afraid that from now on, it will be difficult to compose a mid-autumn festival poem. Yang Yinzhou's eyes were also filled with shock. Even though he was known as the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, he would never be able to compose a poem of this standard. At this moment, all the scholars at the scene were no longer as noisy as before. Yang Yinzhou's gaze once again swept across the paper raft, and finally noticed the name at the bottom. His heart suddenly jumped, and he exclaimed, Li Yi. What? Hearing this, everyone's bodies trembled. They all lowered their heads. In the next moment, an even greater uproar erupted. He is Li Yi. Li Yi from Immortal Magpie Bridge ? That drinking alone under the moon was also written by him. The moment they saw the name of the poem, the shock in their hearts exceeded the poem itself. Ever since the Mid-Autumn Festival a month ago, everyone had their own guesses as to who the author of Immortal Magpie Bridge was. But it was undeniable that this person's talent was astonishing. With just one Mid-Autumn Festival poem, he had already been elevated to the same status as Yang Yinzhou and Shen Zhao. Including Yang Yinzhou, who knew how many people wanted to meet this scholar named Li Yi, but no one was able to do so. No one thought that he would appear in such a manner. With a wave of his hand, he produced an extremely high-standard Mid-Autumn Festival poem. Not just Shen Zhao, but even among all the scholars in the Jing Kingdom, who could compare to him? Thinking of this, everyone couldn't help but glance at Shen Zhao, who was still happily writing. The expressions on their faces were especially interesting. A month ago, because of the Immortal Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao tore his proud work into pieces in front of all the scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. He announced that he would never compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem again. From today onwards, he probably wouldn't even be able to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem. If 2 lovers love each other for a long time, why would they stay together day and night? Raising a cup to the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. May we live together for a long time, Yang Yinzhou muttered to himself, and a self-mocking smile appeared on his face. He said, Everyone says that I, Yang Yinzhou, am the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. When I compete with others, I have never tasted defeat in poetry. Today I know that there are people better than you. From now on, the title of #1 scholar in Qing and prefecture should not be mentioned again. Brother Yanzhou, Scholar 1 opened his mouth, but in the end, he only patted his shoulder and didn't say anything. The immortal on the Magpie Bridge, Drinking Alone Under the Moon, Shui Diao Getu. These poems were enough to scare many people to death. If Yang Yanzhou still carried the title of the foremost scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, this was not praise for him, but a great mockery. He looked at the back of the scholar with a complicated expression and sighed in his heart. Since Li Yi was born, how could Yang Yanzhou be born? He couldn't help but look in Shen Zhao's direction. He must have committed too many sins in his past life to have to compete with this kind of person. After today, Shen Zhao would probably have a hard time keeping a foothold among the scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. Look, even though this style of writing is not restricted by rules, the strokes are smooth, the structure is simple, and the strokes are continuous. Amidst the frenzy, there is a hint of elegance. I'm afraid that he is quite accomplished in calligraphy. A scholar stared at the manuscript on the table and suddenly exclaimed. When the crowd heard this, they all lowered their heads to look at it. For some reason, the words that looked like a child's scribble now looked much more pleasing to the eye. There seemed to be a certain rhythm between the lines. Thinking about it carefully, what the scholar said just now did seem to make some sense. Brother Wang's words are reasonable. Our eyes were blind and almost made a mistake. Not bad, not bad. How could someone with such talent not know calligraphy? Could it be that this style was created by this brother? Yang Yanzhou stood to the side and listened to the discussions of the crowd. A trace of doubt floated onto his face. Could it be that the other party's cultivation level was too high? Even with his skill in calligraphy, he could not comprehend the beauty of this style? Even Li Yi couldn't help but blush when he heard these words. He coughed to hide the awkwardness in his heart. When he put down his brush, he saw Li Xian, Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zumo, and the others standing behind him. They looked at him with a complicated expression. What is it? Is there ink on my face? Li Yi was stunned and asked in confusion. He reached out and wiped his face. He looked down at his palms. There was no ink. No one nodded and no one spoke. Li Xian looked at him with a burning gaze. It was as if he was meeting him for the first time. Originally, he thought that the other party was an interesting scholar who was good at painting, greedy for money, and had a low tolerance for alcohol. On top of that, he had cured his mother's depression. His impression of him improved greatly, and he was willing to interact with him. But who would have thought that this scholar, who did not have any outstanding qualities other than his good looks, was so talented that even the top scholar of Qing and prefecture had to admit defeat? This guy was even better at hiding than he was. Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zumo, and the others were just as shocked as he was. First, they found out that the young master from yesterday was Li Yi, the one who created Immortal Magpie Bridge. Before they could recover, Shui Diao Getu appeared out of nowhere. Not only did it stun all the scholars present, it also stunned them. Especially when they remembered that he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society in name. They all wondered if they were dreaming. Pa! Shen Zhao threw the brush in his hand onto the table. The writing on the Xian paper was vigorous and powerful. It was vigorous and free. Even if one ignored the content, it could still be considered a good piece of calligraphy. After all, his reputation as the second scholar did not come from nowhere. To be recognized by so many proud scholars in Qing'an Prefecture, Shen Zhao definitely had some ability. He turned his head and saw that the scholar opposite him seemed to have finished writing. The corner of his mouth twitched and he strode over. Because of the distance, when Shen Zhao was concentrating on writing, he did not hear the discussion. At this moment, he walked in front of Li Yi's table and lowered his head to look. His expression froze for a moment, then he laughed loudly. Is this your work, or is it a child's random scribbling? At this moment, Shen Zhao no longer had any doubts about the outcome of this competition. However, as he laughed, his laughter gradually became softer. Because at this moment, he was the only one laughing. The surrounding talents all looked at him with a strange expression. The smile on Shen Zhao's face froze. An extremely bad feeling suddenly arose in his heart. Brother Shen, At this moment Su Wentian walked over in a daze. In his hand was a paper raft. He looked at Li Yi with a complicated expression, and handed the paper raft to Xin Zhao. Chapter 91. At the other end of the pavilion, countless women raised their heads and looked in a certain direction, their hearts filled with anticipation. In the pavilion where the competition was taking place, other than a few talented women, almost all of them were men. With their status, it was naturally not appropriate for them to go over. Who do you guys think will win this competition? A pretty woman asked with her hand on her cheek. Of course it will be young Master Shun. I also think it will be young Master Shun. Yes, young Master Shun is so talented. How could he lose to a nobody? The surrounding women all spoke up, their thoughts shockingly in unison. No one felt that the nameless scholar could win against the second talent of Qing and Fu, Xin Zhao. After all, Xin Zhao had been famous in Qing and Fu for a long time. In the hearts of these women, his position was naturally higher. But that young master isn't a nobody. A young girl interrupted. Hearing this, a woman asked. Right, I still don't know what his name is, Xiao Yun, do you know? The young woman shook her head and said, I also don't know what that young master is called. But when I came over from that side, I heard them say that young master is the one who composed Drinking Alone Under the Moon, and Nian knew yesterday. What? It's actually that scholar. Among these women, there were clearly many who knew these two poems. After a moment of surprise, they said hesitantly, if it's that scholar, he might not necessarily lose. But why is young Master Shun competing with that young master in poetry? Competing in poetry between scholars was a very common thing, and not something to be surprised about. But usually if there was no conflict between the two, it would just be a normal exchange of pointers. But if it was elevated to the level of a battle, it meant that the conflict between the two could not be resolved. The young woman who had just spoken looked around and said somewhat mysteriously, I heard that because young Master Shun made things difficult for the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society, that young master, as a member of the Yunying Poetry Society, could not stand young Master Shun's actions. So he stood out. Everyone knows what happened next. Ah, how is it possible? How could young Master Shun be this kind of person? I've heard before that Xin Zhao is arrogant and narrow-minded. I thought it was just a rumor. Who would have thought? I suddenly don't want young Master Shun to win. Me too. After the young girl's words were confirmed by a few other women who were also in the know, the balance in these women's hearts finally tilted. At this moment, a young lady dressed like a servant ran over from afar with a paper raft in her hand. She ran to the lady's side and handed the paper raft to her while panting. Is there any news from there? When the women saw this, they all crowded around him. How is it? How is it? Who won? When will the bright moon appear? I asked the clear sky with a cup of wine in my hand. I wonder what year it is in the heavenly palace. That woman cast her gaze up and recited in a low voice. Her beautiful eyes suddenly burst out with a strange splendor. The few women gathered their heads, and after a moment, their pretty faces revealed the same expression as hers. This was written by that young master? After a moment, the woman raised her head and looked at the young servant girl. She asked in disbelief, Miss Name. The young maid had run all the way here, and was panting from exhaustion. She finally caught her breath, and opened her big eyes wide. She hurriedly pointed at the bottom corner of the paper raft and said, Name? What name? The young lady, who looked like a well-bred lady, looked in the direction that the young maid was pointing. In the next moment, her beautiful eyes involuntarily widened. Her cherry lips slightly parted as she cried out in surprise, Li Yi. The name Li Yi was not an unfamiliar name to the women of Qing and Fu. Ever since the Immortal Magpie Bridge came out, it was unknown how many young girls in love, young married women, on lonely nights, in the depths of their chambers would recite. If the feelings between two could last forever, why would they stay together day and night, while thinking of their absent lovers? Even those unmarried young girls would imagine a certain scene in their minds. Perhaps in their erotic dreams at night, they would occasionally dream of that scholar named Li Yi. For the women of this era, a man's talent was, without a doubt, a fatal attraction to them. Appearance was actually ranked lower. Of course, if he was a scholar with both talent and appearance, he would certainly be pursued by countless women. Is that the Li from the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge? Ah, that handsome gentleman, is that Li? In an instant, countless women raised their heads and looked in the direction of the water pavilion in the center. Their eyes were filled with a strange light. I hope that people live long, thousands of miles apart. When Shen Zhao read to this point, his voice was already trembling. Fine beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He suddenly raised his head to look at him and said in a trembling voice, "You are that the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge? Brother, if you have finished writing, why don't you hand it over to the scholars to judge?" Li looked at him and asked with a smile. Hearing this, Shen Zhao's face turned pale. He knew his own limits. The other party had even brought out such words. What need was there to judge? He was just asking to be humiliated. "I lost." Shen Zhao's face was pale. After squeezing out these words from between his teeth, he turned and left. "Brother, please wait." Seeing that Shen Zhao was about to leave, Li hurriedly called out to him. "What else do you want?" A trace of anger appeared on Shen Zhao's face. He had already lost face in front of everyone today. Was the other party still not willing to let it go? Li didn't speak, but his eyes looked at his waist. Shen Zhao finally remembered something. His face darkened even more. He tore off the jade pendant at his waist and casually threw it over. Li hurriedly caught it. If it was broken, 300 liang of silver would be gone. When he walked to the side of his table, Shen Zhao's footsteps paused. He grabbed the poem he had just written and tore it into pieces. The scholars saw this familiar scene and couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. If they had known this would happen, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. Li held the jade pendant in his hand. In his heart, he was thinking about going to a pawn shop later. 300 liang of silver was enough to rent a shop in a slightly more prosperous area in Qing'an Prefecture. At that moment, a delicate young girl walked in from outside. She walked to Li Yi's side and asked gently, "May I ask if you are Li Yi Li?" Li didn't know what this young girl wanted. He nodded in confusion. The young girl smiled and handed over a piece of paper. "Will you be free tomorrow? My young mistress would like to invite you to her residence for a chat. This looks like Miss Chen's servant. Miss Chen is official Chen's daughter." Seeing this, all of the candidates had expressions of shock and envy on their faces. Before Li Yi could react, a few more young girls walked in from outside. After bowing to Li Yi, they spoke in a gentle voice. "My young mistress admires your talent very much. Tomorrow, there will be a banquet at the Drunken Fragrance brothel. Will you be free?" "My young mistress. My young mistress. That's Miss Chen's servant. That's Lu Qiaoqiao's servant, even Prefectural Magistrate Dong's daughter." Behind Li Yi, the little prince Li Xian stared blankly at this scene. His expression was incomparably complicated. Chapter 92. Since they were daughters of noble families, they had been taught from a young age that their every action had to be dignified and courteous. Not to mention daughters of noble families like the daughter of Magistrate Dong, or the daughter of the Chen family. Even the slightly more famous courtesans of Qing and Prefecture were usually very reserved and would never publicly invite a stranger. Although most of these girls had only sent their own servant girls, the personal servant girls represented their own wishes. Li Xian really couldn't understand why a mere poem would have such a strong attraction for these girls. It should be known that even though he was a little prince and a relative of the imperial family, these girls only maintained proper etiquette when they saw him. They definitely wouldn't go this far. In this aspect, his influence as a little prince wasn't even as great as Yang Yanzhou, or Xin Zhao, and other famous scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. But he had never heard of the daughter of Magistrate Dong ever inviting Yang Yanzhou. Li Xian was very certain that if Li Yi nodded his head right now, perhaps there would be many girls willing to offer themselves to sleep with him tonight. This kind of thing was not rare for scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. After tonight his talent would spread. In the future, he wouldn't even have to pay to visit brothels, and there would probably be girls willing to throw themselves at him. Don't doubt this. There are historical records that show Lu Yong and Tang Bohu were both masters who didn't pay to visit brothels. Spending a night with the #1 scholar of Qing and prefecture was a good opportunity for those prostitutes to become famous. If they could get him to write a poem, something along the lines of flirtatious, graceful, and devastatingly beautiful, it would be a good hype and would greatly increase the attention of the market. And this kind of handsome, talented scholar was the ideal candidate for Rui in the hearts of the daughters of noble families. In his mind, the scene of Li Yi being surrounded by all kinds of girls floated up. If he could receive his true teachings, in the vast Qing'an prefecture, would there be a girl he couldn't handle? Thinking of this, Li Xian made a decision in his heart. He was definitely going to be a friend. Looking at the girls in front of him handing over handkerchiefs, invitations, and the like, Li Yi felt a headache coming on. After living 2 lives, he really couldn't handle such a scene. He looked to Lu Rui for help, only to find that she was standing there, staring at Zheng Zimo. No one knew what she was thinking. Just when Li Yi was about to be overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of these girls, Mississippi Lu finally looked over, as if she had heard the call in his heart. Li Yi gave her a look, and Lu Rui walked over slowly. The girls felt a gentle force pushing them away. She blinked her big innocent eyes and looked at her with a smile. At this time, she had only taken 1 step. Zimo you. Wan Ruoqing's cherry lips opened slightly. Her pretty face was full of surprise as she looked at Zheng Zimo. She was a little speechless. Now that she had it, a sly smile appeared on Zheng Zimo's face. She looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, "Sister Ruoqing, you already have a mortal magpie bridge. Why don't you give this Shui Diao Geta to me?" At this time, the top artist of the jadeite courtyard was like a sly little fox. Her face was full of a smile of success. Not far away, Yang Yinzhou's footsteps stopped, and a wry smile appeared on his face. Someone else had actually made the first move. At this time, outside the garden, Li Yi held onto a big tree and closed his eyes. Only then did the dizziness in his mind subside a little. He had never experienced the feeling of a roller coaster in his previous life. After coming to this world, he had experienced it twice. He was extremely curious. As a woman, why did Lu Rui always not take the right path and like to fly around on the wall? After a long time, when the palpitation completely disappeared, Li Yi turned his head and looked at the pretty woman beside him. His eyes were filled with hidden bitterness as he said, "Lu Rui, you will lose me like this. If you can't even endure this little bump, you won't be able to become a second-rate master, even if you practice martial arts for the rest of your life." The sword-hugging woman leaned on a book and glanced at him. The reason she gave actually made Li Yi speechless. As she spoke, one of her lily-white hands retracted into her sleeves. Li Yi didn't see the paper raft that she had secretly hidden. Chapter 93. Today, Qing'an Prefecture was a city that never sleeps. No matter if it was the taverns, brothels, or other shops, they would all be open all night. This was because the profits from this one night were enough to cover several days of normal business. For a place like the tavern, half a day's profit was almost equivalent to 10 days of normal business. Only an honest person like Old Fong would give himself a break when business was at its peak. At this moment, he was probably beating his chest and stamping his feet in regret when he saw the booming business of the other Tonghalu vendors. After coming out of the poetry gathering, Li thought about it carefully and felt some regret. Wasn't it a bit too rash to take out a name like Shui Diao Getu that could be passed down for 100 generations? Even though he had gotten a jade pendant, that jade pendant could at most be exchanged for 300 taels of silver. Thinking about it, it seemed like he had suffered a loss. Just now, any poem from the selected poems of the Song dynasty would have been enough to subdue Xinjiao. In the end, he had been too impulsive. However, it was too late for regrets now. He didn't think about it anymore. Calming himself down, he picked a pawn shop that looked more proper and walked in. An hour later, Li Yi and Lu Rui walked out of the pawn shop. That Shun guy said that this jade pendant was worth at least 300 taels of silver. The black-hearted owner of the pawn shop actually only offered 150 taels, cutting the price by more than half. Li Yi used 15 minutes to whittle the price down to 200 taels, but the other party refused to budge no matter what. In the end, When Lu Rui's delicate brows furrowed and her jade-like hand had already touched the hilt of her sword, Li Yi saw that the situation was not good and hurriedly brought up Shen Zhao's name. Otherwise, this pawn shop owner would be in big trouble tonight. It had to be said that Shen Zhao's name was very useful. Since it was the jade pendant of the second scholar of Qing and Prefecture, the price was naturally higher. After the pawn shop owner confirmed it, he finally increased the price to 300 taels of silver. Before he left, he deliberately stuffed another 10 taels of silver into Li Yi's hand. With a face full of enthusiasm, he expressed that if Li Yi could get Yang Yinzhou's jade pendant the next time, he was willing to pay double the price. If Li Yi was not satisfied, the price could be discussed again. Li Yi could more or less guess the pawnshop owner's intentions. For a talented man like him who was famous throughout Qing and Fu, there must be many women who admired him. Among them, there was no lack of young ladies from rich families who did not lack money. Buying him for 300 taels and then selling him to them, he could probably earn quite a bit of money. Li Yi couldn't help but sigh in his heart. In this world, talents are indeed popular. When he became famous one day, he could sell autographs, used socks, unwashed underwear, and so on. He could probably make a small fortune. That's right, he seemed to have forgotten to bring the Shuidiaogetu that he had just written. He really shouldn't have. After all, that was the first edition of the manuscript. After he became famous, he would definitely sell it for a few hundred taels of silver. Was it too late to go back and get it now? When he thought of those women who were like wolves and tigers, Li Yi immediately dispelled this thought. With 300 taels of silver in his pocket, Li Yi and Lu Rui were strolling around the busy street. Naturally, he didn't know that the entire Mianxiu garden had already completely boiled over because of that Shuidiaogetu. A few old men with white hair and beards surrounded a table and stared fixedly at the xian paper on the table. Zheng Zimo stood far away and really wanted to snatch back that Shuidiaogetu manuscript. However, when she remembered that the old men in front of her were all famous figures in the literary world and had extraordinary statuses, she forcibly suppressed this thought. As a scholar, your handwriting is so sloppy. What a disgrace. An old man's hair was standing on end as he spoke angrily. This caused the surrounding scholars to look at each other, but none of them dared to say anything. Although this old man's temper was explosive, the other party's status was there. Even the prefectural magistrate didn't dare to say anything. The old man had been an official for many years and had students all over the world. There was no lack of high-ranking officials among them. Prefectural magistrate Dong was also a disciple of the old man. Now that he saw the old man, he had to respectfully call him teacher. After venting his anger, the old man's gaze once again fell on the paper. However, this time, his murky old eyes shone brightly. After a long while he sighed and said, "What a good poem. People have joys and sorrows. The moon has its waxing and waning. I hope that people live long and live together for thousands of miles. To be able to write a mid-autumn festival poem to such a level, I'm afraid there is no one else in the entire Jing kingdom who can do this. This person's attainments in poetry have probably reached an unfathomable level. I heard that the immortal Magpie Bridge on Chinese Valentine's Day was also written by him." Another old man beside him retracted his gaze and sighed as well. One poem is full of amorous feelings. The other is bold and unconstrained. The atmosphere is magnificent. It's hard to imagine that these two completely different poems were written by the same person. From today onwards, as long as the students of the Jing Kingdom drink under the moon, they will definitely think of raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadows of the three of us. On Chinese Valentine's Day, they will not forget the immortal Magpie Bridge and Shuidiaogetu. I feel that if he were to compose another Upper Yuan poem, there would be no need for the next few poetry competitions. Just based on poetry alone, even if I were to call him the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom, there wouldn't be many who would object. The old man nodded his head, expressing his agreement. However, in the next moment he raised his eyebrows and scolded, "This kid! Has he never thought of practicing his calligraphy?" The surrounding scholars stood respectfully at the side. Hearing the old man and the other famous figures' evaluation of Li Yi, They couldn't help but be secretly shocked. The number one scholar in the Jing Kingdom. Since ancient times, there was no number one scholar. When one's poetry reached a certain level, it was difficult to distinguish who was better. There had never been a person who received such an evaluation from them. The Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet was closely watched by the scholars of Qing and Prefecture. Any news would quickly spread. Not long after, a piece of paper floated out of Mianxiu Garden like flying snow. Some busybodies, including the old man's evaluation of the poem, handed it over without the slightest deletion. This included the praise of Li Yi as the number one scholar in the Jing Kingdom. Very quickly, the news spread throughout the prefecture. In an extremely short period of time, various brothels were already filled with the tune of Shuidiaogetu. Li Yi of the Immortals of the Magpie Bridge appeared at the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. In a rage for a beauty, he brazenly accepted a challenge from the second scholar of Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao. With one Shuidiaogetu, he stunned the audience and actually caused Shen Zhao to tear his poem twice. When the scholars heard this story, it was as if they were there. Their hearts were filled with hot blood and anger, and they only hated themselves for not being there to witness it. When countless women in their chambers heard their maids talk about the news they heard from outside, their beautiful eyes shone with a strange light. At this time Li Yi, who was completely unaware of this, was still wandering the streets. However, it was different from before. Right now there were many more things in the bag on his back. Pouches, perfume pouches, bracelets, hairpins, rouge and face powder. Last time, Rui had given him a piece of clothing that she had personally made. Politeness demanded reciprocity. Now that Li Yi's wallet was bulging again, he naturally wouldn't be stingy in this area. However, if he bought it for Rui, Xiaohuan would definitely also want a portion. Otherwise, even if the little maid didn't say it, she would definitely be hurt in her heart. If he bought it for both of them, he couldn't leave out Rui. If he treated Mississippi Lu differently, the consequences would be very serious. Although this would seem insincere, but at worst he would just give Rui another gift in the future. Seeing Li Yi once again walk into a jewelry shop, the corners of Lu Rui's mouth curved slightly. Just as she was about to follow him in, her footsteps suddenly paused. Her gaze fell on the two scholars who walked past her on the street. Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. Shuidiaogetu, Minister of Education. That Li Yi, the first scholar of the Jing Kingdom. After obtaining this information from the conversation between the two, Lu Rui's pretty brows furrowed. With confusion and surprise, she looked at the back of the figure in the shop who was bargaining with the shop owner. Chapter 94. The liveliness of Qing and prefectural city would continue for an entire night. But for Li Yi, who had seen even more bustling scenes, after the novelty wore off, he no longer had any interest in strolling around. By the time he returned to the stockade village with Lu Rui, it was already late at night. He didn't see Fong and the others. These country bumpkins who had never seen the world would probably only return at dawn. Li Yi asked Lu Rui to bring the gifts he bought for them into the inner courtyard. After returning to his room, he washed up and went to bed. He didn't have Mississippi Lu's stamina. After walking so much and flying around in the sky, he was still full of energy. As he lay on his bed, he thought about a few things. After the Mid-Autumn Festival, he would start selling Rui's necklaces. Before that, he still needed to rent a shop. In addition, it was time to bring forward the matter of the factory. These few days, he was really exhausted. After these things were over, he still needed to rest for a while. After thinking about this for a while, his eyelids started to feel heavy. At this time, in the inner courtyard, in Lu Rui's room, the two sisters were whispering as usual. Lu Rui's face was filled with surprise and astonishment. Is husband really that amazing? Lu Rui spoke with interest about the expressions on the faces of the scholars in Qing and prefectural city when Li Yi took out the poem in Mianxiu Garden. Occasionally, she would glance in the direction of the window. Outside the room, the little servant girl carefully stuck to the corner of the window. Tonight, she had changed her hair into a new bun with a new hairpin that the son-in-law had bought for her. She tried her best to stick her ear close to the window. When she heard the whispers coming from inside the room, Her beautiful big eyes sparkled, and her little face was flushed. She looked extremely adorable. The son-in-law is composing a poem again. The number one scholar. Is he more amazing than all the other scholars? The little girl thought to herself. When the voices in the room gradually quieted down, she raised her head and glanced outside before tiptoeing away. He had been busy all night yesterday, and it was already very late when he woke up in the morning. In the school, as long as he was not around, Lu Xiaohu would take the initiative to take on the responsibility of being the class leader and teach those brats well. Li felt that he could slack off again today. After running outside, he practiced Tai Chi in the courtyard as usual. Of course, he found the books in the library. Regardless of whether they were useful or not, he just treated it as killing time. The scale of the provincial library was already very large, so naturally, there were other martial arts books. However, Li Yi had no intention of learning fighting, sanda, taekwondo, judo, and the like. In this world where everyone was a Super Saiyan, even if he practiced judo and taekwondo to the 100th stage, he would not be able to withstand a few punches from someone like Old Fong. And if he was unlucky and met Lu Rui, the future world boxing champion, or mixed martial arts champion, could probably be defeated with a single strike from her. After all, no matter how powerful those people were, they were not so powerful that they could fly in the sky. In the library, there were many traditional Chinese martial arts, such as Tai Chi, Xingyi Quan, Baguazhang, Tongbei Quan, and so on. But those that could be displayed in the library were naturally extremely simple moves. It was impossible to get to the real core. It was fine to practice for fun, but it was completely impossible to become a martial arts master by relying on these. Of course, it was naturally impossible to find peerless secret manuals like 9 Manual, 18 Subduing Dragon Palms, and 6 Pulse Divine Sword in the modern library. Instead of relying on these, it was better to practice the martial arts basics that Lu Rui had thrown to him. Although he had not yet cultivated the so-called true qi that Rui had mentioned, Li Yi had been learning martial arts for a long time. He estimated that he would have no problem fighting against 3 weak scholars like Shen Zhao. A little further away, Lu Rui stood outside the arched door that connected the two courtyards. Seeing Li Yi doing some strange movements, her beautiful eyes showed some surprise. In the first few days, when Li Yi told her that this was a martial art called Tai Chi, Lu Rui did not take it to heart. In martial arts, speed was the key to defeating the slow, and the strong to defeat the weak. It was similar to what he said when he told stories about strange martial arts. In the world of martial arts, there is nothing that cannot be overcome. Only speed cannot be overcome. When she heard this, Lu Rui was quite shocked. This summary was really straight to the point. In today's martial arts world, there were many different sects and schools, but they could not escape these words. However, such a sentence that could shock the martial arts world was said by such a scholar. Even grandmasters would be ashamed to hear it. When Lu Rui calmed down these days, she carefully pondered over the few words that he mentioned when he told stories. Unexpectedly, she also realized something and made a small progress in martial arts. Although she still did not break through the shackles and step into the Grandmaster realm, it was very rare for her to make such a small progress with her current realm. Therefore, when Li Yi said that Tai Chi was about defeating the strong with the weak, defeating the fast with the slow, and conquering the hard with the soft, Lu Rui just smiled. Defeating the strong with the weak, and doing the opposite, how could there be such a wonderful martial art in the world? However, these past few days, she had often seen these movements, so she still paid some attention to them. His movements were natural and smooth, extremely coherent, and didn't seem like he was doing it randomly. As Lu Rui watched, she couldn't help but imitate a move. It seemed like something flashed through her mind, but when she thought about it carefully, there was nothing. After Li Yi finished the turning and stroking, he saw Lu Rui's beautiful starting hand full of beauty. He was stunned for a moment and said, "My wife, do you want to learn Tai Chi? I can teach you." Lu Rui smiled and said, "My husband is busy all day, you don't have to worry about me. I have nothing to do anyway, and it is not difficult to learn." Li Yi waved his hand. When he practiced martial arts, he was ordered around by Lu Rui all day, and Lu Rui occasionally came to give him advice. It was not easy to get a chance to reverse. How could he let it go so easily? Tomorrow, he would ask Lu Rui if she wanted to learn it. At that time, he would definitely make things difficult for her, reprimand her. Rotten wood cannot be carved. To save some face. Then I'll have to trouble you, my husband. Lu Rui smiled slightly. At this moment, she was a little curious about this method of borrowing strength to fight strength, and using little effort to achieve a great deal of wealth. After a moment, in the small courtyard, the conversation between the two gradually became more frequent. This movement is not like this. Tai Chi is in a circle. My wife, try to experience it. I understand. For this movement, you have to raise your hand a little higher. Yes, that's right. After a moment, the topic was changed by Li Yi. My wife, your martial arts are so powerful. Have you heard of the Enlightenment method? What is Enlightenment method? It is a martial arts master who, through a certain secret method, imparts his lifelong skills to another person, and the person who has imparted his skills will instantly become a peerless master. My husband, you must be joking again. Skills are not goods, how can they be imparted? My husband, you must have seen it in those strange novels again, right? Ah, there is no such method. Li Yi's voice sounded a little disappointed. Another hope of becoming a martial arts master was dashed again. Chapter 95. As for Lu Rui's speed of learning Tai Chi, Li Yi already didn't know what words to use to describe it. It was because he had a heaven-defying cheating device that he was able to master it in a very short period of time. However, Lu Rui only needed to be taught twice and corrected a few movements before she was able to execute a near-standard Taiji fist. Although there were still some flaws, she was beautiful and tall. More importantly, she had a strong martial arts foundation. The movements she executed were much better than Li Yi's. This made Li Yi, who was standing at the side, sigh in his heart. These movements were indeed different when done by a woman. Whether it was practical or not, at least it looked extremely pleasing to the eye. Not long after, there was a knock on the door, which made Li Yi unable to enjoy it so peacefully. It didn't sound like Fong. The way he knocked on the door was much rougher than this. It also wasn't Lu Rui. When second miss came back, she never had to go through the trouble of knocking on the door. She could just fly in from outside. Li Yi walked over and opened the door. He saw two middle-aged men standing behind the door, their faces full of smiles. Seeing the two men, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. They looked familiar. He thought that he had seen them before. After thinking carefully, he remembered that it was last night. The two of them sent some eggs and mooncakes, and then he sent Xiao Huan away. As for their identity, it seemed that they were one of Lu's sister Rui's uncles. They belonged to the direct line of descent. Ever since the Lu clan settled down here, the two girls had quite a few uncles after a few generations of inheritance. It had to be said that the Lu family's ability to produce sons was not just for show. It was said that Lu Rui's grandfather had 5 brothers, and the 5 of them each had their own children, giving birth to a bunch of sons. They were Lu Rui and her sister's uncles. On the other hand, the direct line of descent was only passed down from Lu Rui's father's line. There were only 2 girls in the next generation. 4th uncle, 7th uncle, what's the matter? Although Lu Rui had never gotten along with these people, as juniors, she still had the necessary etiquette. Lu Rui walked over and bowed to the 2 of them. Let's talk inside, let's talk inside. Seeing that Li Yi and Lu Rui didn't seem to want to invite them in, the 2 of them laughed dryly. May I know why 4th uncle and 7th uncle have come this time? After a while, Lu Rui looked at the 2 of them and asked again. Most of these uncles weren't on good terms with her and her sister. Yesterday, the 2 of them had eagerly sent gifts over, which had already made her extremely surprised. Now that he had come to visit again, it seemed that he really did have something important to do. The 2 of them looked hesitant, but their eyes flashed with determination. They took out a few pieces of yellowed paper and placed them on the table in front of them. 4th uncle, what do you mean? Lu Rui looked at the things on the table and turned to look at him. Finally, a trace of doubt appeared in her beautiful eyes. When her father was still alive, the village was one, But when he had an accident, those uncles immediately wanted to separate from the family. The two sisters were still young at that time, and almost all the things that belonged to them were taken away. At that time, the other party didn't give them any face at all. Why did their temperament change now? The middle-aged man on the left said, Rui, what happened in the past was our fault. When we separated from the family, these land deeds should have belonged to you and Rui. You should accept them. Fourth uncle, what do you want to say? Just say it. Of course. Rui wouldn't think that they suddenly found their conscience and wanted to return the things that they had taken away. There must be a bigger plot for them to act like this. The middle-aged man hesitated for a while and said again, Since Rui said so, I'll say it directly. You know, these 2 years have not been good, and life at home has been really hard. In a few days, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to even eat. Look, the sugar-coated haws made by the son-in-law are so popular. Can we? At this point, the middle-aged man's meaning was already very clear. Although the sugar-coated haws business was good, people only recognized the loose sugar-coated haws sold by Fong and the others. The business of other vendors was still bleak and pitiful. If they also wanted to make a fortune by selling sugar-coated haws, even if they got the secret recipe, without their consent, they couldn't use the name of the loose, and the profit would still be pitiful. If they could get their consent and start the sugar-coated haws business, then this land wouldn't be much at all. The land in the stockade wasn't considered good farmland to begin with. When the year was good, the production could more or less meet the needs of life. If it was a disaster year like last year, there was almost no harvest for the whole year. Then what was the use of the land? If they had known that Rui would be able to snatch such a son-in-law in a few years, there would have been no separation of the family that year. They would have desperately fawned on the two sisters if they could. Husband, you decide on this matter. Rui didn't answer them. She turned her head and said to Li, regarding the sugar-coated haws, he had been the one doing it from beginning to end. Rui had never asked, so naturally, she wouldn't make the decision for him at this time. In fact, Li had already roughly understood the intentions of Rui's uncles last night. The status of the loose sugar-coated haws in Qing, a prefectural city, was roughly equivalent to the old Beijing sugar-coated haws of later generations. It was a time-honored brand with guaranteed quality. They were only after this name. He turned to look at the two and smiled. Fourth uncle. Seventh uncle, right? Ah. The two knew in their hearts that whether or not they could succeed today depended on the scholar in front of them. They hurriedly responded, and the smile on their faces became even more amiable. Li's expression was hesitant. He revealed a thoughtful expression and said, It's not impossible for you to use the Lu's name to sell sugar-coated haws. But what? The two immediately asked. But you can only do it in the form of an alliance, Li said, looking at them. What do you mean by an alliance? The two looked at each other and asked Li in confusion. Even Rui's beautiful eyes showed a trace of doubt. It was clearly the first time she had heard of such a term. The meaning of an alliance is very simple. We can agree to let you use the Lu's name to sell sugar-coated haws, but we will take half of the daily profits, Li said, looking at them. The Lu's sugar-coated haws name was not so easy to spread. It was not very realistic to ask them to fork out a large sum of money in advance. Explaining the concept of an alliance to them in the future was also like playing the lute to a cow. They could only use this simple and crude method. 50%. The two of them exclaimed at the same time. This number, for them, was a little too much to bear. No one would be willing to give half of the hard-earned money to someone else. Son-in-law, isn't 50% a little too much? Fourth uncle of the Lu's looked at Li and asked with some difficulty. Li smiled without saying anything, indicating that there was no room for discussion on this matter. After bullying my wife and sister-in-law for so many years, it was time to pay back some interest. Let us think about this matter. Li smiled as he watched the two of them walk out the door, waiting patiently. After a moment, the two of them walked back in. Fourth uncle thought for a moment, then said, 50% is really a little too much. We'll go back and think about it. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. He was obviously extremely unwilling to give half of the profits to others. After the discussion between the two of them just now, when they went back, they would join forces with the other direct family members to put pressure on them. It would be best if they could waive the alliance fee. But if that was not possible, it was not impossible to reduce it to half. After saying that, he turned around and walked out the door. Rui, son-in-law, without your agreement, I won't be able to earn even 50%. 50%, then 50%. I agree. Fourth uncle of the Lus had one foot out the door when he heard the familiar voice of seventh uncle behind him. Bang! Fourth uncle of the Lus tripped on the doorsill, and his body flew forward half a foot before landing heavily on the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. Fourth uncle, why are you so polite? Not too far away from him, old Fong was standing there, looking at the scene before him with a look of astonishment on his face. If he did it well, there would be no reward. If he didn't do it well, his bonus of half a month of candied haws would be deducted. Fong was extremely suspicious in his heart. This was definitely the son-in-law's revenge for what he did last night. He didn't want to take this hot potato, but he thought that if he didn't let the son-in-law vent his anger, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to sleep well every night. Sooner or later, there would be a knife. This time, it was better to take it happily. If he had known that retribution would come so quickly last night. Alas, he regretted it so much. He sighed all the way back, and saw a figure pacing back and forth in front of the door from a distance. It was a thin man, pacing back and forth while rubbing his hands. From time to time, he glanced into the courtyard, but he didn't take a step in. Yang Xiaojun, what are you doing here? Fong walked over with large strides and looked at the man. His face turned cold as he asked coldly, Fong I. The man suddenly heard a voice behind him, and turned to look at Fong. A trace of shame appeared on his face. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said with some difficulty, I came to borrow some food from you. There hasn't been any food at home for 2 days. It doesn't matter if I don't have enough to eat. But the child. Fong's face was rarely gloomy. There was an irrepressible anger in his eyes as he looked at the man. When Rui's father was still alive, this man was like himself and the others. He was also by the side of the direct line of descent. They grew up together and were considered the closest brothers. However, ever since the old stockade master left, only Fong and a few others stayed. The man and most of the others chose to get close to the direct line of descent. From then on, Fong and him did not have any contact. Even when they met in the stockade, and the man wanted to greet him, Fong would just coldly walk past him. Being betrayed by his best brother was a knot that had been stuck in Fong's heart for all these years. I've let you two ladies down for what happened back then. I've let you down. You can beat me up, but I'm begging you to lend me some food. Otherwise, the child will really starve to death. The shame on the man's face deepened. He was a famous man. Even if he had to starve to death, he wouldn't have been able to lower himself to look for Fong. However, there was still a child at home who hadn't eaten for 2 days. Fong's expression was still cold, even though he knew that the man had been driven into a corner and had no choice but to leave in order to feed his family. There was always a thorn in his heart. Even now he could not forgive him. Seeing that Fong did not speak for a long time, a hint of defeat finally appeared on the man's face. A look of despair appeared in his eyes as he turned around and walked away without saying a word. He would rather starve to death than beg for help. Chapter 97. Li Yi did not doubt whether Fong had visited the brothel last night. It was not because he believed in his character, but because he did not have that much money. Although the candied haws business brought in money every day, with Fong's current savings, it was not enough for him to visit a brothel. That kind of brothel was a place where the rich went. Fong's wife was in charge of the money, and it was good enough that she could give him a few dozen copper coins as pocket money. If he went to that kind of place, he might not even be able to afford the cheapest girl. However, although Fong looked a little embarrassed, he seemed to be in a good mood, so Li Yi did not continue to ask. If this was the daily hobby of the couple in the bedroom, It would be a little awkward for an outsider to ask. The construction of the workshop was left to Fong and the others. These men were all experts in many aspects. They were good at farming, herding horses, building walls and fighting. Except for some things that needed to be told in advance, Li did not need to worry about it. As for the location of the workshop, after a round of inspection by Li and Fong, they had more or less decided on it. Considering safety and confidentiality, of course, the workshop could not be built in the stockade village. Using the distillation method to purify alcohol required open fire, and alcohol was flammable. If something happened and the stockade village was set on fire, it would be very lively. Of course, confidentiality was also a big part of the reason. Whether it was the production of Rui dew or the distillation of alcohol, there was not much technical difficulty. If the confidentiality was not done well, and someone learned it secretly and spread it, then naturally, these two things could not be used to make money. Considering the transportation, water source, and many other factors, the location of the workshop was finally chosen to be outside the stockade village, next to a stream near the back mountain. The stream was not big, and there had never been a mountain flood for decades. It was convenient to get water, and it was very safe. He gave the finished drawing to Fong. He only needed to go and look at it every day, and he did not need to worry about other things. As a man who majored in engineering, although he did not specialize in civil engineering or architecture, things like drawing couldn't be more simple for Li. The blueprint of the workshop was based on the workshop of the future. Only some minor changes were made according to the actual situation. There were only a few drawings, some flat, some three-dimensional, and some simple lines, but they clearly expressed the structure of the workshop. It was clear at a glance. Fong and the others only needed to build according to the drawings. Of course, before that, he had to first rent a shop in the prefecture city. Originally, he had only planned to rent a normal shop, but after winning against Shen Zhao yesterday, he had gained 300 taels of liquid capital, so he had to change his plans. 300 taels of silver was enough to rent a shop with a good location in a bustling area. Originally, he planned to go down the mountain to rent a shop and renovate it over the next few days. Then, he would take out some Rui nectar to test the market. After the workshop was built, he would be able to mass-produce it. However, changes often came a little faster than planned. Many people in the village were eyeing the candied Ha's business. In the past, it was not easy for the direct descendants of the Liu family to ask for it. Of course, they also knew that even if they asked for it, Fong Laosan and the others would not agree. However, the success of Fong Laosan and Fong Laosan made them widen their eyes. Just by handing over 2 land deeds, they could sell candied Ha's in the name of the Liu family. Although the joining fee of 50% made their hearts ache when they thought about it, as long as they could succeed in the candied Ha's business, even if they had to hand over 50% of the profits, they could still live a much better life than what they had now. No matter how they looked at it, it was a good deal. Land was the foundation of a family. Under normal circumstances, they would not easily hand over the land. However, how much food could the land produce in a year? Usually it was fine, and the family could always eat their fill. If the harvest was bad one year, the whole family would have to tighten their waistbands to live. Looking at Fong Laosan and the others, they had only been with Rui's son-in-law for a short time. What kind of life were they living now? How could the direct descendants feel at ease? As a result, in the past 2 days, Li Yi's house was almost trampled to the ground by these people. Land deeds joining fee. They had already gotten the information they wanted from Fong Laosan and Fong Laosan. These people were very straightforward. They slapped the land deeds on the table one by one. Before Li Yi mentioned the joining fee, they took the initiative to make an agreement. 50% was 50%. Everyone would get 50%, and no one would lose out. From the beginning to the end, these uncles' attitudes were very humble. The smiles on their faces were as kind as they could be. After all, no one wanted to go against money. What kind of life they would lead in the future was completely up to Li Yi's decision. Lu Rui did not ask about what Li Yi had done. She only silently put away the land deeds that Li Yi had handed over to her. However, Xiaohuan's pretty face was full of smiles these days. After being bullied for a long time by those people, she was very happy to see them talking to the son-in-law with a smile. To be honest, Li Yi was not interested in the land. In this era, as long as one wanted money, it was a very simple thing to buy land. Moreover, the land here was not like the land in the future, where the right to use it was only for a few decades. Even if the dynasty changed, it would only recognize the deed and not the owner. If it was your land, it would be your land. In order to maintain stability, the ruler would not take back the land. As long as you had the land deed, you were still the owner of the land, and no one could take it away. The barren land of Willow Leaves Village was really not attractive to Li Yi. He just wanted to take back what should belong to them. The real reason why he asked the direct descendants of Luz to intervene in the business of candied haws was that Fong and the others should always leave some soup for others to drink. Under his wise leadership, Fong and the others would only get better and better in the future. Even if Fong wanted to live in a big house and marry a concubine, it was not impossible. There was no harm if there was no comparison. A few people were living a well-off life, but most people in the village were still hovering above the line of food and clothing. The gap between the rich and the poor was so big. If it went on like this, there would be trouble sooner or later. But now, such a hidden danger had been extinguished by Li Yi before it even had a chance to show itself. Of course, it only solved the problem of the direct descendants of Luz. After all, most of the people in the village were the former bandits like Fong and the others. Their lives were even more difficult. However, for these people, being able to fill the stomachs of their families was already the greatest satisfaction they could get. This request was not too high. Even if Li Yi did not mention it, old Fong and the others would also think of helping out on a daily basis, so there would not be any major problems. Chapter 98. Brother, may I know where the nearest broker house is? On the busy street of Qing'an Prefecture, the handsome scholar stopped a passing man. He cupped his hands in obeisance and said with a smile. The man cupped his hands in obeisance and said with a smile, "Go straight ahead for about half a mile, cross a street, and then turn left. After crossing 2 streets, you will see a marketplace." "Is the broker house in the marketplace?" The handsome scholar looked at him and asked. No, there are many people in the marketplace. Brother, you can ask someone there. Someone should know where the broker house is." The man smiled and turned away with a calm face. Looking at the back of the man leaving, Li Yi forced a smile on his face and felt like thousands of horses were galloping in his heart. He was not in a hurry to ask the broker. He was a little tired after walking all the way down the mountain. He rested for a while at a tea stall on the side of the street, wondering if he should buy a carriage. The distance between Willow Leaf Village and Qing, and prefectural city, was more than 20 miles. If he only relied on walking, it would take him more than 2 hours to get there. However, it seemed that it was useless to buy a carriage. Some mountain roads were rugged and inconvenient, so a carriage couldn't pass. No wonder Willow Village was so poor before he came. They didn't even understand the principle of to get rich, build roads first. They guarded a few acres of barren land and lived in isolation for decades. It would be strange if they could get rich. After drinking a cup of tea to quench his thirst, he asked the tea stall owner. He didn't expect that the owner really knew where the broker house was, and enthusiastically pointed out the direction for Li Yi. The broker house in this era was equivalent to the 58 cities in the future. Renting houses, buying and selling maids and servants were all within the scope of the business of the broker house. In the broker house, there was no need to worry about encountering illegal agents, because all the brokers were registered by the government and had a certificate. Once someone complained about them, they would be sued. According to the tea stall owner's guidance, Li Yi soon found the broker house. As soon as he entered the gate, several people surrounded him. "Master, do you want to rent a house or buy maids?" "Master, I grew up in the prefecture and am very familiar with this place. No matter what you want, I'm sure you will be satisfied." "Master." The guys in the broker house were all very enthusiastic. This scene was a little similar to the time when Li Xian took him to the brothel last time. However, it was no wonder that they were so enthusiastic. In this line of work, how much they earned depended entirely on their performance. If a customer wanted to inquire about something here, they had to pay a certain fee. Their wages came from this fee, and the more customers they attracted, the more their commission would naturally be. If they met a generous person, as long as the customer was satisfied, they would naturally reward them with money. The young master in front of them looked extraordinary, so he must be a big customer. These middlemen had dealt with all kinds of people all year round, so they were quite good at judging people. Li casually picked a smart-looking guy. The others couldn't help but show disappointment on their faces, but they could only retreat helplessly. "Young master, what do you need? Don't hesitate to tell me. I will definitely satisfy you." The waiter rubbed his hands together and said with a smile, "I need to rent a shop in the prefecture, a moderate size, preferably in a bustling area. How about the rent here?" Li didn't beat around the bush and said straightforwardly. The waiter was obviously very familiar with this. He said without thinking, "If it's in an ordinary area, the rent of an ordinary shop is about 100 taels. If you want to rent a shop in a bustling area, I'm afraid it will cost at least 300 taels of silver." This price was not much different from what Li had expected. However, 300 taels of silver was not a small number after all. After the shop was rented, it would definitely need to be renovated, which would cost at least dozens of taels of silver. In this way, there would not be enough money to buy the raw materials for making ruidu. 300 taels of silver is a little expensive. Li smiled, took out a piece of broken silver from his arms, and put it on the table in front of the waiter. The broken silver was at least 1 tael. Seeing this, the waiter's eyes suddenly lit up. He swept his sleeve across the table, and the silver disappeared. When he looked at Li again, the smile on his face became even more radiant. "Young master, you have found the right person this time. I just happen to know of a shop in a bustling area that is urgently for sale. The price is about 20% lower than the market price. If young master is interested, I will take you there immediately." Reality proved that money could make the devil turn millstones. This saying had been used since ancient times. Most things in the world could be solved with money. If it couldn't, then it meant that the money you gave was not enough. 1 tael of silver was enough to make the waiter's attitude become extremely enthusiastic. He immediately took Li to see the shop. The location of the shop was not bad. It was on the main street of the Qing'an prefecture. Outside was the busy street. The shop was about 3 feet long and 6 feet wide. It could be considered spacious. More importantly, there was a small courtyard and 2 rooms at the back of the shop. According to the waiter, the family that originally did business here moved to the capital after their business became big, and the shop was left empty. However, this shop was located in the bustling area of the prefecture. If it was left empty, it would be too much of a waste. Therefore, they asked the broker to rent it out for them. Because they left in a hurry, the rent was much lower. As for the courtyard and rooms at the back of the shop, they were also given to them for free. After looking at the shop and the courtyard behind it, Li started to feel uneasy. To be able to rent such a place for less than 300 taels of silver, it was almost no different from a pie falling from the sky. He looked at the waiter with some suspicion and asked, "Tell me honestly, is there something wrong with this shop? Was there a murder case, or was there a ghost?" Hearing this, the waiter was stunned at first, and then he said with a bitter smile, "Young master, you have wronged me. Everything I said is true, without any concealment. If you don't believe me, you can ask around." At this moment, the waiter felt bitter in his heart. 1 tael of silver was almost equivalent to a month's salary. If it wasn't for the fact that this young master had been so generous, he definitely wouldn't have mentioned such a good thing so easily. Forget it, forget it." Li waved his hand. If there was really a problem here, the broker would not take such a hot potato. Moreover, one should be upright and not suspect others for no reason. At this time, a stout fat man came out from the cloth shop next door. Seeing this, Li hurried to go up. "May I know your name?" Are you the shopkeeper of this cloth shop? The fat man nodded and looked at Li Yi with doubt. My surname is Su. What can I do for you? Shopkeeper Su has been here for a long time. Have you heard that the shop next door is haunted? The waiter just walked out of the shop and heard this. He couldn't help but stagger and almost fell. Chapter 99. Looking at the pale face of the fat man in front of him, and the cold sweat on his forehead, it was obvious that he was not very brave. Li Yi more or less understood what was going on. This shop was definitely not haunted. Otherwise, the fat man would have moved out a long time ago. Since that was the case, he still had to take advantage of the situation. 250 taels of silver to rent a shop like this, and a small villa with a courtyard in the first ring of Qing and prefectural city. It was really a good deal. He immediately signed a contract with the middleman. The lease period was 1 year, and he readily took out 3 silver notes, each worth 100 taels of silver. Seeing this, the waiter's face was filled with ecstasy. His previous unhappiness had long been forgotten beyond the highest heavens. 250 taels of silver. Just the commission alone was enough for him to earn a few months' salary. However, when it was time to pay, the young master insisted on giving him 250 taels of silver and 1 copper coin. This made the shop assistant puzzled for a long time. Of course, perhaps this was the rich young master's hobby. This was not important to him. One handed over the money, and the other handed over the goods. After an hour, Li Yi held the contract with the red seal of the government. He looked at the shop in front of him with satisfaction. For the next 1 year, the right to use this shop belonged to him. This was only a small step in his plan to make money. It was a big step out of the Willow Leaf village and into the prefectural city. Little brother, you just said, this shop is haunted. Is it true? The fat shopkeeper leaned against the door of the cloth shop next door. He looked at Li Yi with a pale face and asked, It's just a joke. Shopkeeper Su, don't take it seriously. Li Yi gave him a kind smile and turned to walk into the shop. Phew! The fat shopkeeper let out a long sigh of relief. His body slowly slid down from the door of the shop and collapsed on the ground. He raised his head and looked at Li Yi with eyes full of resentment. The matter of renting the shop was much smoother than Li Yi had imagined. He was also very satisfied with this shop. Of course, even though it was rented, it couldn't be put into use immediately. At the very least, it needed to be renovated carefully. As for how to decorate it, Li Yi hadn't thought about it yet. Moreover, Fong and the others were busy building the workshop recently, so he had to wait until they finished their work. After renting the shop, Li Yi was not in a hurry to go back. He closed the shop door and locked it. He strolled around the streets around the shop to familiarize himself with the environment. Speaking of which, the middleman was quite reliable. This area was almost at the center of Qing and prefectural city. It was extremely prosperous with rows upon rows of shops. Restaurants and brothels could be seen in just a few steps. Not far from the shops was a market square. People came and went, and it was very lively. Li Yi also noticed that there was a brothel next to the shop. To put it bluntly, it was a modern theater. In this era without mobile phones, television, movies, and the internet, scholars and scholars strolled around the brothel and recited poems. This was the most common form of entertainment. As for ordinary people, they could only listen to storytelling and plays. The brothel was the main performance venue for these entertainment programs. In the future, if he was bored, he could often go there to sit, drink a cup of tea, and listen to a few tunes to kill time. This was not a bad idea. Of course, the current him didn't have the leisure to do so. Brother Lu, look, isn't that the person from that day? When Li Yi passed by a brothel, 3 young men happened to walk out. One of them raised his head and looked at the figure in front of him. His expression was startled. Then he immediately pointed at him and said to the person beside him, Yes, Brother Lu. Isn't that the person who insulted Fong Wentian and made Brother Lu lose face? The person beside him looked in the direction he was pointing and exclaimed, It's him. The man who was called Brother Lu looked at the young scholar who walked past them, and his face couldn't help but turn gloomy. That day at the poetry meet, he had taken a liking to the other's servant girl. What could he do? The other was unwilling to exchange and completely disregarded him, the son of the county magistrate. Although with his vengeful personality, he would not let this matter go. There were so many people present that day. No matter how angry he was, he couldn't do anything. At the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, he heard that the person had written some good poems, that even Xin Zhao had to concede defeat. These days, the popularity of the person seemed to surpass Yang Yanzhou and become the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. He had a grudge against him, so naturally, he was extremely unhappy. Later, although he had investigated him, he didn't find anything. He guessed that the other had no background and wanted revenge. Unfortunately, he couldn't find the person. After a few days, he had almost forgotten about this matter. Who would have thought that he would run into him here today? Follow them. The youth surnamed Lu said coldly and quickly followed them. This was a rare opportunity. If he let the other escape this time, he didn't know when he would meet him again. Although the safest method was to find some people first, there was clearly no time for that. Furthermore, the other was only one person. They had 3 people and had the advantage in numbers, so they were not afraid of him. The 2 people beside him looked at each other. There was a trace of hesitation in their eyes, but they still followed. At the same time, Li Yi, who was walking on the street, suddenly frowned and his footsteps slowed down. It was not good to make a move in the busy streets. The 3 people quickly stopped and pretended to look around. A wastrel and 2 scholars. Their tracking skills were really clumsy, and their acting was terrible. No matter what, Li Yi had been taught by the 2 heroines. Very quickly, he felt that someone was following him. He turned his head to look. The exaggerated acting skills of the 3 people were especially eye-catching in the crowd. A trace of a smile appeared on his lips. His footsteps quickened, and he walked forward with large strides. Seeing this, the 3 people hurriedly chased after him. This time he didn't choose a place with many people. After a few turns, he walked into a deserted alley. When the youth surnamed Lu saw this, a trace of joy appeared on his face. He was worried about where to make a move. He didn't expect that the other party would take the initiative to walk to such a place. He gave the 2 people beside him a look, and they nodded. Their figures suddenly rushed out and blocked in front of Li Yi. "What do you want?" Hearing the scholar's panicked voice, a trace of joy appeared on the youth surnamed Lu's face. He said, "What are you waiting for? Make a move." "In broad daylight, you actually dare to hit people?" The scholar's voice seemed to be even more panicked. The youth surnamed Lu walked to the front and sneered at Li Yi. He said, "So what if I hit you? Did anyone see it?" When the youth surnamed Lu said this, the 3 people saw the scholar's expression freeze for a moment. After looking around, a trace of a smile actually appeared on his face. Chapter 100. In broad daylight, deep alleyways with few people in sight, he looked at the 3 people surrounding him. Their faces were dark, their footsteps were unsteady, and their legs were unsteady. One look, and he could tell that their bodies had been emptied by alcohol and women. He had the right time, the right place, and the right people. Moreover, no matter what, he was still the disciple of these 2 peerless heroines. As a young hero of the martial arts world, if he couldn't even deal with these 3 small fries, how would he have the face to learn martial arts from them in the future? He wouldn't even be able to dream of becoming a lowly martial artist in the martial arts world. If Lu Rui were to find out, he would laugh himself to death. You can still smile when you're at death's door. Seeing the smile on the scholar's face, the youth surnamed Lu felt insulted and rushed forward with his fist. Of course, he was only saying it casually. If someone really died, even if his father was the county magistrate of Anxi, he wouldn't be able to protect him. The 2 scholars beside him hesitated for a moment when they saw him making a move, but they still dashed forward as well. Although scholars weren't good at fighting, the county magistrate's son had already stepped forward. If they still stood here, they wouldn't have a good time afterward. The 3 people rushed over aggressively, but Li Yi wasn't afraid at all. Instead, his eyes flashed with excitement. Although he knew that his skills had improved a lot over the past few days, he had never really fought with anyone. Challenging Rui to spar was simply courting death. As for challenging Fong, That fellow didn't know how to control his strength. Li wasn't at ease. At this moment, he finally had a chance to put his plan into practice. He dodged the youth surnamed Lu's punch and swung his elbow at the youth's back. Bam! The youth surnamed Lu didn't expect this scholar to be so agile. Caught off guard, he took a heavy blow to his back and staggered. Before he could turn his head, Li had already kicked his buttocks. Thump! Although he didn't kick someone far away like Fong and the others, he still made him lose his balance and fall to the ground. At this moment, the two scholars had already rushed over. Li turned his head, and a smile appeared on his face. He faced them fearlessly. After a while, Don't come over. Including the youth surnamed Lu, the three with bruised and swollen faces looked at the scholar, who was slowly walking towards them with a trembling voice. Li rubbed his slightly aching fist. The effect of force was mutual. He was not like Lu Rui, who had the protection of true qi. His fist was also aching after beating up these three guys. However, even though his fist was a little painful, his heart was filled with lofty sentiments as he looked at the three people in front of him. No wonder everyone said that he was a weak scholar. If the fighting strength of all the scholars in the world was so weak, then he alone could take on a group of them. The only troublesome thing was that the guy in the lead seemed to be the son of the county magistrate. It didn't seem good to beat him up. After all, Li would probably have to stay in the prefecture for a long time in the future. It wasn't a wise thing to make enemies with this kind of person. However, since the enmity had already been formed, it was useless to regret it now. If there was no other way, he could only look for Li Xian and give him 2 poems to deceive little girls. Based on his character, he would probably agree immediately. Are you done fighting? Just as Li was planning to do so, a faint voice came from behind him. The voice was crisp and pleasant to the ear. Li turned his head and saw a woman leaning against the wall at the entrance of the alley. She was wearing the uniform of a constable and was looking at him with a teasing gaze. The woman was extremely beautiful with an exquisite figure and a valiant and heroic bearing. It was just that the uniform of a constable was a little out of place, causing Li to feel a little uneasy. However, when he saw that it was only one person, and a woman at that, he finally felt relieved. I'm done fighting. Li nodded and looked for an opportunity to escape. Since you're done fighting, follow me back to the yamen. The woman straightened her body and said calmly as she slowly walked toward him. Constable Li, hurry up and catch him. How dare you hit me? You're dead meat. The appearance of the woman caused the fear on the young man's face to disappear instantly. He immediately pointed at her and said. At this moment, the way he looked at Li became ferocious again. Once they reached the yamen, it would be his territory. Although his father had explicitly forbidden him from using his identity as the son of the county magistrate to bully others, none of the constables dared to disrespect him. Once they reached the yamen, all he needed to do was say the word, and this guy would be in for a beating. The woman walked in front of the three and said calmly, The 3 of you, follow me back. What? The young man was stunned and asked in disbelief. You want to catch us too? Fighting in the street, why don't you catch us? Looking at her expressionless words, the young man was stunned for a moment. Then, his face was filled with grief and indignation. How did they fight? They were obviously being beaten. Didn't they see that they were the ones being beaten? Are you blind? Is there any law? Of course, he would not dare to ask such a question, even if he was given 10 guts. After all, although the woman in front of him was only a constable in the yamen, which constable would talk to the county magistrate with caution? As early as the first day he came to the yamen, his father had repeatedly warned him that he could offend anyone in the yamen, except for this madam. If it were any other constable, he would have already scolded them. But at this moment, he could only endure the grievance in his heart. His eyes inadvertently glanced around, and saw that the scholar who beat them just now was about to slip out of the alley. His expression immediately changed, and he pointed at him. He's running away. When the female constable turned around, she saw the figure of the scholar just now disappear from the alley. The corner of her mouth curled up slightly. After taking a big detour, Li could not help but sigh in his heart when he reached the street again. The constables here were really competent. Every time something happened, they could arrive in time. If the efficiency of the police in the future was half as good as theirs, how harmonious and stable would society be? But fortunately, the constable just now was only a woman. Otherwise, he really would not be able to escape today. A woman should stay at home and do embroidery. Why did she come out to be a constable? Would she be able to get married in the future? Why don't you take a detour? Before Li Yi had time to think about whether the female constable would be able to get married or not, he suddenly heard a slightly familiar voice behind him. His face slightly stiffened, and the next moment, he broke into a run without hesitation. Whoosh! A beautiful figure fell from the sky and landed gracefully in front of him, blocking his way. Looking at the woman in front of him who was looking at him with a playful expression, Li Yi's face became a little bitter. I'm doomed. I didn't expect this female constable to be a master. Chapter 101. Walking on the wide main street of Qing and Prefecture once again, Li Yi's mood was completely different. The women in this world were not to be trifled with. This was the conclusion that Li Yi came to after living here for so long. Any random woman he met on the street could be a hidden heroine whose martial arts were frighteningly high. When that woman descended from the sky and blocked his way, Li Yi knew that he couldn't leave today. He regretted not bringing Fong with him today. Even if he came out with Lu Rui, he wouldn't end up like this. Luckily, he wasn't alone. The son of the county magistrate and the two young scholars were standing next to him, looking dejected. They would occasionally turn their heads to glare at Li Yi fiercely, but when they saw the beautiful constable, they would quickly turn their heads back. The county yamen wasn't a good place to be, especially when one was caught for fighting. Luckily, this female constable didn't even give face to the son of the county magistrate. She could be considered as impartial. Fighting could be big or small. At this level, it was at most disturbing the peace. A fine of a few taels of silver was the most they could do. However, if the county magistrate wanted to make things difficult for him, because of his son, things would be a little difficult. At that time, he might really have to use the name of Prince Ning to stabilize the situation first. On the day of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Li Xian once patted his chest and said that in this prefecture, if anyone encountered any problems, they could look for him. Li Yi didn't take it to heart at that time. Now that he thought about it, the little prince really had a crow's mouth. The female constable followed behind them. When her beautiful eyes swept across Li Yi's body, there would occasionally be a flash of surprise. The scholar in front of her looked gentle and weak, but judging from his movements, he seemed to have some foundation in martial arts. This wasn't common among scholars. Of course, this wasn't what puzzled her. Although it was rare for scholars to practice martial arts, it wasn't enough to surprise her. The reason why she paid more attention to the scholar was that she had never seen his martial arts style before. Because of her family background, she did not dare to say that she had read all the martial arts in the world, but her knowledge was extraordinary. Even if she could not name all the martial arts in Jianghu, she could still tell the way. However, the move that the scholar used just now was extremely strange. It was completely different from the various martial arts in Jianghu, but it was definitely not a random move. This made her a little curious. If Li Yi had known that the reason this female constable had brought him to the yamen was because she was curious about his martial arts, he would never have used Tai Chi to tease these three fellows. Naturally, the Taiji moves in the Library of Heaven's Path had been simplified. They might be able to strengthen one's body, but it was impossible for one to become a Taiji expert. A few days ago, he practiced Tai Chi in the morning just for fun. However, ever since he taught Tai Chi to Lu Rui, she would occasionally dismantle the moves and add some variations to them. Then she would give them back to Li Yi. This made this set of martial arts, that was used by uncles and aunties in the later generations, to have some offensive power. Tai Chi was a martial art that used the weak to defeat the strong, and used softness to overcome hardness. It required less strength, which was suitable for the current Li Yi. As for the improved moves, he didn't stop practicing them. Hey, Emingzu, where are you going? The female constable was pondering over the moves that the scholar used just now. At this moment, a voice suddenly came from behind her. The young and handsome man caught up from behind and asked her with a smile. The woman frowned and said, "Back to the yamen." She didn't hear anything for a long time. Seeing that the other party wasn't pestering her like before, she was puzzled. When she looked up, she found that the young man was staring straight ahead. A hint of surprise appeared on his face. He quickly walked to the scholar and said, "Why are you here? How do they know each other?" Seeing this scene, a hint of confusion appeared on the woman's pretty face. Li Yi had never felt like this before. The face of the young prince Li Xian was so amiable. "You know each other?" He pointed at the female constable and looked at Li Xian with anticipation. "Yes." Li Xian looked at him and asked with some confusion, "When did you and my cousin know each other?" "Cousin?" Li Yi was finally relieved. They were all from the old Li family, so the distance between them had been greatly shortened. However, since she was Li Xian's cousin, she was also from the royal family. But how could a member of the royal family be a constable? "Are you done? If you are, then follow me back to the yamen." The confusion on the female constable's face disappeared in a flash. Then, she resumed her indifferent expression. "Back to the yamen?" Li Xian was stunned. He turned to look at her and asked, "What crime did he commit?" "It's a misunderstanding. It's all a misunderstanding." As soon as Li Yi opened his mouth, the female constable waved her hand. "Don't talk nonsense. If you have anything to say, we can talk back to the yamen." Li Xian looked at her, then turned back to look at Li Yi. Whether it was because of their personal relationship or some other reason, he could not sit back and do nothing about what happened today. He quickly walked over and whispered a few words into the woman's ear. The female constable frowned at first, but after a while, her brows relaxed and she looked at Li Yi in surprise. Anne's chronic illness was cured by the person in front of her. She did not want to make things difficult for him by bringing him back to the yamen. She could ignore Li Xian's reputation, but she still had to consider Uncle Wang's. As she pondered, there was a sudden commotion in the crowd in front of her. "This silver is mine." "Nonsense, it's obviously mine." The faint sound of two people arguing could be heard. Someone in the crowd glanced over and suddenly shouted, "There's a constable over there. Let the constable be the judge." Yes, let the constable be the judge. When they saw a person dressed in a constable's uniform, there was a commotion in the crowd, and they immediately rushed over. A few men who had been following Li Xian from afar looked at each other and immediately walked over. They spread out around him and paid attention to any movements in their surroundings. "Lord Constable, you have to uphold justice for this lowly one." A man dressed in coarse cloth grabbed the arm of a scholarly man and walked over to the woman's side as he pleaded. "What exactly happened?" The female constable asked with a frown. "My lord, this lowly one was eating noodles at the noodle stall and accidentally dropped the silver on the ground. This person picked it up, and when this lowly one discovered it, I asked him to return it. However, he insisted that the silver was his to begin with." The man looked anxious. "My mother is seriously ill, and this is money for her to buy medicine to save her life. We can't lose it." "What a load of nonsense." The scholarly man glanced at the man and said, "This silver is clearly mine. Don't you dare try to extort me, you scoundrel." After the two of them spoke, the surrounding crowd chimed in one after another. Some agreed with the man, while others stood on the scholarly man's side. The woman rubbed the space between her brows as she listened to the crowd's chatter. She couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. She didn't know which of the two men was telling the truth, but this matter was really hard to determine. Catching a thief was more like it, but solving a case wasn't something she was good at. "Miss, why don't we make a deal?" At that moment, a weak voice was heard from beside her. Chapter 102. A deal? Emingzu turned her head and looked at the scholar with a hint of surprise in her eyes. She said lightly, "What kind of deal?" "I'll help you solve the case in front of you, and you let me go. Then we're even." Li looked at her and said. Li Xian pulled his sleeve and whispered, "Do you really know who this silver belongs to?" He knew his cousin's character very well. It would be fine if Li Yi didn't say anything. If he found out that he had fooled her in the end, it would not be easy to solve today's matter. Li Yi gave him a reassuring look, and Li Xian didn't speak anymore. Although he didn't know how to judge who this silver belonged to, since he knew Li Yi, everything he did was unexpected. He didn't know what method Li Yi had thought of at this moment, and he began to look forward to it. What do you have in mind? Li Mingzhu's face showed an expression of interest. Usually, there was no other way to deal with this kind of ambiguous dispute in the county government. After a few floggings, they would confess. There was no need to be so troublesome. She wanted to see what the scholar could do. It's very simple. Since we can't tell who the silver belongs to, we can just split it in half. Everyone will be happy. Li Yi took out 2 pieces of silver from his bosom, each about half a tael. He snatched the silver from the Confucian scholar's hand and stuffed them into the bosom of the burly man and the Confucian scholar. Seeing this scene, the young prince Li Xian couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. This method was really simple and crude, but could his cousin pass it? Sure enough, when he turned his head and peeped, he found that the scholar's face became a little ugly. The young man surnamed Liu, and the other 2 stood aside and watched the scene. Seeing this, they almost couldn't help laughing. If everything could be solved in this way, why did they need the county magistrate? Isn't this a mess? What kind of method is this? This scholar is just messing around. How can he solve a case like this? Seeing this, the onlookers immediately became noisy, one after another, talking at the same time. Sir, you mustn't do that. If I lose half of the money, I won't be able to buy my mother's medicine. The burly man's face immediately revealed a pleading expression as he looked at Imingzhu and said, "This young master's words are reasonable. A scholar should have a magnanimous heart. I won't argue with a scoundrel like you. How about I give you half of the silver?" When the Confucian scholar heard this, a trace of joy appeared on his face, and he immediately said, "Is this the solution you mentioned?" Imingzhu turned to look at Li Yi. A dangerous glint flashed in her eyes. "Of course not." Li Yi smiled, looked at her, and said calmly, "There is only one truth." He suddenly turned around and pointed his finger at the Confucian scholar, shouting, "Murderer! Bah! He's the one who lied." The situation changed so quickly that no one in the crowd could react. While the Confucian scholar was still in a daze, Li Yi had already snatched the silver fragment from his hand and stuffed it into the burly man's arms along with the silver ingot. "Be careful next time. Take these 2 silver fragments as well. Buy your mother's medicine quickly." Li Yi was not a generous person, but if the burly man had not lost the silver, he might have been taken to the county government by the female arrestor. It was rare for her to be generous to him. What's going on? The young prince Li Xian was confused and still in a daze. The onlookers also started to ask questions. Why? Why are you so sure that he's the one who lied? I can't figure it out. Everyone looked at Li Yi, waiting for his explanation. Mingzhu's pretty face showed a trace of doubt and some realization. She also turned to look at him. Nonsense. Why are you so sure that I'm the one who lied? The Confucian scholar's face showed a trace of panic, but it was soon replaced by grief and indignation. He looked at Li Yi as if he was really wronged. Because the silver originally belonged to this burly man, so of course he didn't want to give half of it to others for no reason. Li Yi smiled and pointed at the Confucian scholar, saying, "And he, because the silver didn't belong to him, he could get half of it for no reason." Of course, he agreed so readily. Hearing his explanation, Li Xian's face showed a look of realization. He looked at him in surprise. How did he come up with such an ingenious way to solve the case? And the pretty Imingzhu next to Li Yi also looked at him differently for the first time. After hearing Li Yi's words, the crowd was stunned for a moment. Then they immediately burst into an uproar. This young master's words make sense. Brilliant, really brilliant. I was almost cheated by this guy just now. I almost wronged this burly man. In an instant, the way everyone looked at Li Yi changed. Their gazes were filled with respect and admiration. When they turned to look at the Confucian scholar, their faces were filled with disdain. What a disgrace to a scholar! As a scholar, How could he do such a despicable thing? He even cheated his mother of money to save her life. Is he still human? Take him to the magistrate. At this moment, the Confucian scholar's face finally showed panic. When he raised his head to look at Li Yi, his heart was filled with grief and indignation. Trap. It was all a trap. So the other party had set a trap for him from the beginning, waiting for him to fall into it. But at this moment, he naturally couldn't admit it. With a wronged expression, he said loudly, "This is just your deduction. I didn't expect that my momentary kindness would be taken advantage of by a villain. I'm not convinced. I want to go to the county government. I want to see the county magistrate." Not convinced. Li Yi narrowed his eyes. Are you really not convinced? I'm not convinced. The Confucian scholar raised his head and looked at him with a trace of resentment in his eyes. Smack. Li Yi slapped his head. Are you convinced? The Confucian scholar didn't expect that this scholar would dare to hit him on the street. He was stunned. When he came to his senses, he pointed at him with a trembling finger. You, how dare you hit me? So what if I hit you? Li Yi frowned and slapped him again. Are you convinced? No. Are you convinced? Ouch. I'm not convinced even if you beat me to death. Seeing Li Yi slap the Confucian scholar's head again, the crowd was stunned on the spot. The corner of young Prince Li Xian's mouth twitched again. As for the young man with the surname Liu and the other two, they seemed to have thought of something bad, and their faces all darkened. On the other hand, the female constable crossed her arms and looked at the scene with interest. She didn't seem to want to stop it at all. Are you convinced? After countless slaps, even his hands were a little numb. The Confucian scholar finally couldn't take it anymore. Stop hitting me. I'm convinced. I picked up the silver on the street. At this moment, the Confucian scholar only felt that his head was getting bigger, and he was dizzy. With tears in his eyes, he said, I lost all my money in the gambling house this morning. When I passed by that man, I saw the silver fall from his arms, so I got the idea. Please stop hitting me. Seeing that the Confucian scholar finally admitted it, Li Yi let out a long sigh of relief and withdrew his hand. He straightened his body and looked at the female constable with a smile. Look, he admitted it. Chapter 103. Thank you, young master. Thank you for upholding justice for me. The man held the silver in his hand and bowed to Li Yi with a flushed face. When Li Yi proposed to split the silver, the man was still complaining about him. Now that he knew it was all part of Li Yi's plan, he felt very guilty. This young master was helping him, but he doubted him just now. He shouldn't have. Li Yi smiled at the man and turned to the female constable. He cupped his hands and said, The case has been solved. I'll take my leave now. Just as he was about to walk out of the crowd, he saw the woman suddenly reach out to grab him. Li Yi was startled. His feet curved in an arc. Just as the woman's hand was about to grab him, he used a push hand, causing her wrist to turn at an angle. Naturally, this grab missed. After personally experiencing this strange martial art, a look of astonishment appeared on the woman's face once again. You didn't keep your promise. Li Yi took the opportunity to take a step back and pointed at her angrily. When did I say that I would let you go? The woman looked at him and said indifferently, Just now you. Li Yi only said a few words before he said nothing else. After thinking for a while, he realized that she really didn't say that. Boss, what happened? A few constables ran over from afar. When they saw the county magistrate's son standing there with a swollen face, they were shocked and turned to ask the woman, Bring them back to the yamen. The female constable pointed at the young man with the surname Liu and the other two. Then, she pointed at the Confucian scholar, who was still standing at the side with his hands on his head. Immediately, the constables restrained them. Young master, I'm sorry. A constable walked to the young man with the surname Liu and said in a low voice. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder symbolically. Compared to the county magistrate's son, he was obviously more unwilling to provoke the female constable. Seeing that she didn't point at Li Yi, the young man with the surname Liu widened his eyes and said with great grief and indignation, Where is he? The female constable ignored him and said indifferently, Take him away. Yes. Although the constables didn't know what happened, they still responded respectfully and escorted the few people to the yamen. This is not fair. You're condoning and shielding. Is there still any law? The voice of the youth surnamed Lu gradually faded away. The female constable glanced at Li Yi, but didn't say anything else. She turned around and left in a carefree manner. He turned around and said to Li Xian, "Thank you very much for what you did today." Seeing that the powerful woman had left, Li Yi finally let out a sigh of relief. He turned around and cupped his hands towards Li Xian. He was a little impulsive today. If he hadn't met Li Xian, he would have been in trouble. Darn it. Li Xian smiled and suddenly said, "However, if you feel that you owe me a favor and feel bad about it, why don't you give me a few poems? Li 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 Yu Xian Li Li King Yu Li Li, Li 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 of." Li Li Xian said, Li Li Xian Li Li. But if you feel bad about owing me a favor, why don't you give me a few poems? Li Xian shook his head. Li Yi was stunned. What do you mean by the Jing Kingdom's #1 scholar? The young prince Li Xian looked around. Seeing that the crowd hadn't dispersed, he said, "This isn't a good place to talk. Let's find a quiet place and talk while we drink." Hearing Li Xian's words, the expressions of the people scattered around him changed. After a while, in a restaurant in Qing'an Prefecture, in a private room, Li Xian looked at Li Yi in surprise and asked, "You really don't know?" Li Yi drank a cup of tea to moisten his throat and replied, "I really don't know." He really didn't know when he became the #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom that Li Xian mentioned. That immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Was it really written by you? Li Xian asked again. "Brother Xiaoyu, please forgive me, please forgive me." Li Yi prayed in his heart and nodded shamelessly. "You really can't judge a book by its cover. I didn't think that your literary talent would be so high." Li Xian looked at him with a different expression. Although the title of Jing Kingdom's #1 scholar was only known in Qing'an Prefecture and hadn't been recognized by all the scholars in the world, to be able to make those old men act like this, it was already extremely impressive. After all, even though he was a young prince, he had only received the evaluation of rotten wood cannot be carved from them. Thinking about how this fellow could receive such an evaluation from those arrogant old men, he couldn't help but feel a little indignant. "So what if I'm rotten wood? Did I beg you to carve me? You're really crazy." Of course, these words could only be said in his heart, and he absolutely didn't dare to say it out loud. "What do you mean by you can't judge a book by its cover?" Li Yi looked at Li Xian with a strange expression. Did he even know how to converse? Moreover, although he missed that face that he had seen for 20 years, he had to admit that in terms of appearance, the current one was still a little better. Even if it was Li Xian himself, he wouldn't dare to say that he was more handsome than him, right? Among the women who invited you that day, there were famous courtesans from Qing'an Prefecture, Emingzu from the rich and powerful families, and even the daughter of the prefectural magistrate. After that night, who knows how many famous courtesans from the brothels said that they were willing to sleep with you. As he spoke, the young Prince Li Xian's face was full of envy. Li Yi's expression was a little dazed. Did this mean that if he went to sleep with him, he wouldn't have to pay if he went to the brothels in the future? He looked up at the opposite side and got a positive answer from Li Xian's face. In that case, he didn't have to work hard to sell candied haws, floral water, and so on. Now he could sell autographs and portraits to make money. If a poem was written on the portrait, the price might even be doubled. This was a business that was almost guaranteed to be profitable. As he thought of this, the scene of being surrounded by women that day suddenly appeared in his mind. The expression on Li Yi's face froze, and he immediately dispelled this idea. One shouldn't be too ambitious. It was better to do business down to earth and be a quiet and handsome man. Tell me, when will my cousin treat me like those women treat you? How good would that be? Li Xian seemed to have triggered something in his heart. He showed a look of longing and muttered to himself. Li suddenly looked up at him and couldn't believe his ears. Cousin? That female constable just now? Li Xian, this guy actually likes his cousin? At this moment, his mind had automatically filled in the scenes of a vigorous moral drama. When he looked at him again, The expression in Li Yi's eyes changed for the first time. It was as if he was looking at a beast. An ill-fated relationship. Chapter 104. A cousin marrying a younger cousin, and a younger cousin marrying a younger cousin. If this had happened in the future, not only would the law not allow it, but even if they had such an idea, they would still have their legs broken by the parents of the two parties. But in today's era, it was a very normal thing. The saying cousin and younger cousin are a match made in heaven had existed since ancient times. The ancients, who did not have the concept of genes and heredity, thought this was adding family to family. Thus, such a twisted complex was created. After thinking through this matter, the strange look in Li Yi's eyes slowly disappeared. He let out a long sigh. Child, the fault is not on you. The fault is on this world. However, it seemed that in the ancient times of his original world, cousins could marry, but cousins could not. Although the people of that era were still lacking in scientific knowledge, the concept of ethics and morality was more profound than that of the later generations. Cousins were considered to be very closely related by blood, so they were definitely not allowed to get married. If anyone dared to have any ideas about their cousin, they would still have their legs broken. Could it be that the people of this world did not have such an understanding? When he became more familiar with Li Xian, he wanted to find a chance to remind him. If the two of them really did get married in the future, and gave birth to an idiot, or a child with some kind of birth defect, Li Yi would really feel apologetic. That's right, where do you live? Why can't so many people in Qing and Fu find you? Even the daughter of Magistrate Dong couldn't find you, after using the power of the government. Li Xian looked at him, and suddenly remembered something. He had been puzzled about this matter for a long time. That time, when he cured his mother's depression, Ning Wangfu had also sent people to search for him, but to no avail. There were quite a few people named Li Yi in the records of the government, but after investigating them one by one, they found that none of them were the person they were looking for. There was one person whose age and identity matched, but when they sent people to ask, they found that the scholar named Li Yi had lost his mind not long ago. After running out of the village, he had never returned. The villagers searched everywhere, but to no avail. They had already reported him to the government and listed him as a missing person. Losing his mind, naturally it wouldn't be him. He lives in a remote area outside the city. It's normal that he can't find him, Li Yi replied. Li Xian seemed to think of something and said, In a few days, it will be my mother's birthday. You should come with us. Last time you cured my mother's illness, the whole mansion has not properly thanked you. The people who would attend Wang Fei's birthday would definitely be people of status in Qing, a prefectural city. Why would he go? Li Yi had originally wanted to find a reason to refuse, but after some thought, an idea suddenly popped into his mind. After a moment of hesitation, he still nodded his head. There are still some days before my mother's birthday. Tell me your address, and I'll send someone to invite you. Forget it, we'll talk about this later. Li Xian waved his hand and looked at him with an expectant expression. He said, Let's talk about how many poems you are going to give me. Clearly, this was still on Li Xian's mind. Are you so sure that your cousin likes things like poems? Li Yi sighed and looked at him as he asked. He always thought that his emotional intelligence was low enough. He didn't think that there would be a weirdo whose emotional intelligence was even lower than his. These women, don't they all like poems? Li Xian raised his head to look at him, and asked with a stunned expression. Those so-called scholars in Qing, a prefectural city, often used a few poems to trick the hearts of those women. Wasn't it because they all liked this kind of style? Putting aside the distant, once the immortals of the Magpie Bridge, and Shuidiao Getu appeared, who knew how many women in Qing, a prefectural city, secretly admired Li Yi? Didn't this mean something? Li Yi looked at him like he was looking at an idiot. You've known her for so long. Have you ever seen her talk about poems in front of you? The expression on Li Xian's face froze. After thinking for a moment, he shook his head and said, I don't think so. The women of the world all have different appearances and different personalities. How can they be lumped together? They are actually the same as men. There are those who revere literature, and those who revere martial arts. Which type do you think she is? Although Li Yi had only met the female bailiff once, he had some understanding of her personality. Her martial arts were so high that she was probably the same type Rui and Rui. Those who revere martial arts usually look down on scholars who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken. She was far from those young ladies of noble families who could win their hearts with just a few words of romance. On the other side, after hearing Li Yi's words, Li Xian's expression had become serious. He seemed to have sunk into deep thought. Li Yi stood up and patted his shoulder. When pursuing a woman, you can't be too hasty. First, you need to understand her likes and dislikes. Acting rashly will only produce the opposite of the desired result. As the words left his mouth, he felt that something was amiss. Was he teaching Li Xian how to woo a woman? Woo his cousin? In that case, he was actually helping him in his sin? At this moment, Li Xian's face revealed a look of realization. When he looked at Li Yi again, his expression had changed considerably. He cupped his hands and said, "Listening to a wise man's words is better than reading books for 10 years. You are the true expert in this field. I should have known that you would be able to conquer such a beautiful wife's younger sister. Admirable, admirable." Li Yi's expression darkened again. He felt that he could no longer continue the conversation with this fellow. After the conversation, Li Xian was no longer concerned about how many poems Li Yi should give him in return for his kindness. He turned his attention to something else. Before they parted, he once again reminded Li Yi that the next time they met, they must have a good conversation. What was the matter with the psychology of women, and 36 ways to woo a woman, that Li Yi had mentioned? The address that Li Yi left behind was not the Willow Leaf Stockade. At that time, the shops in the prefectural city would probably be open for business. He could go there directly to find him. As for the fact that Li Yi had opened a shop in Qing'an Prefecture, Li Xian was still somewhat surprised. Scholars, farmers, merchants, and merchants had low status. Generally speaking, scholars were disdainful of doing business, thinking that it would lower their status. Many high officials and nobles were like Ning Wangfu. Although they also had business outside, they would never stand in the open and cooperate with those merchants. They would leave the public matters to them. However, he knew Li Yi's way of doing things. He had never been able to figure out Li Yi's way of doing things. He didn't seem like an orthodox scholar at all. If not for that, Li Xian might not have been interested in him in the first place. Of course, as for the Rui Du, that he had never heard of, Li Xian also had a strong curiosity in his heart. That strange painting and sugar-coated haws. The things that he made were always unusual. He didn't know what the Rui Du was. When the time came, he must see it. Chapter 105. The shop in the prefectural city was about to open, and Li Yi planned to be the boss himself. After all, although the village was quiet and peaceful, it was perfect for retirement. However, he had not saved enough for retirement yet, so he had to work hard for a few more days. Of course, living in the village for too long would be boring. The prefectural city was bustling, and it was far more interesting than staying here. However, this reason was not as important as the previous one. As such, he naturally had to put aside the matter of the school. With his current influence in the village, he could already make decisions for such a small matter. Most of the direct descendants of the Liu family relied on him to make money, so they naturally had no objections. "Miss Qin, I'll have to trouble you to take care of these children in the future," said Li Yi as he cupped his hands and bowed to a seemingly weak young girl at the entrance of the school. The young girl's surname was Qin, and her first name was Qing. She looked a little delicate, and her body exuded a faint scholarly aura. Qing's grandfather was Mr. Qin. Before Li Yi came here, he was the one who taught in the school. However, he accidentally fell and injured his leg a few days ago, so he would probably have to stay in bed for the rest of his life. After Li Yi left, the school still had to continue. In the future, the young girl in front of him would take over his position. She had been by Mr. Qin's side since she was young, so she could read and write. She could be considered one of the few cultured people in the village. Of course, there were still many people in the village who had doubts about how a woman could become a teacher. However, they had no say in this matter. Ever since they were able to establish a business relationship with Li, they could not wait to build a good relationship with him. Perhaps one day when he was in a good mood, they could even waive some of the joining fees. Naturally, they would not oppose him on such a small matter. Brother-in-law, can I really become a teacher? The naughty children in the school did not see the two of them, and were still playing around inside. The young girl glanced into the room, and a hint of hesitation appeared on her pretty face as she asked timidly. When Li asked for her opinion, the young girl hesitated for a long time before agreeing. Firstly, it was because she really liked these things in her heart. Previously, when her grandfather was a teacher in the school, she often looked forward to when she could stand in that position. However, it was just a thought. After all, in this world, women could not do things as freely as men. Another reason was that they had received too much kindness from Li in the past few days. It was impossible for her to refuse such a small matter. Their father passed away when they were young, and there were only their mother, daughter, and their elderly grandfather at home. Although life was hard before, they could still get by. However, after their grandfather accidentally broke his leg, life became more and more difficult. If it wasn't for Xiao Huan, who often brought him rice and noodles, he would have died a long time ago. Therefore, the girl's family was extremely grateful to them. Don't worry. It's just teaching them a few words every day. It's not that difficult. Li smiled. Out of habit, he wanted to reach out and pat her on the shoulder to show his encouragement. Halfway through, he realized that it was not appropriate. He retracted his hand and pointed to the inside of the school. Let's go in. Hearing this, the young girl nodded and followed behind Li. After the two of them walked into the school, the originally unusually noisy naughty children immediately quieted down and obediently returned to their seats. Seeing that there was a beautiful older sister next to the teacher today, the naughty children's eyes immediately sized her up. Most of them knew that this older sister seemed to be Mr. Qin's family, but they didn't know why this older sister came with the teacher today. Today we won't be in class. Last time, we talked about the story of Ho Yi shooting the sun. Today, we will talk about Kwa Fu chasing the sun, Chang'e flying to the moon, Jingwei filling the sea. Qin Qing took the initiative to sit on the side. Li Yi's gaze swept across the school as he spoke. With this sentence, the naughty children's attention immediately shifted away from the young girl. Their faces revealed extreme excitement. In the past, as long as they performed well in class, the teacher would tell them a story after class. From those stories, they learned that heaven and earth used to be connected. There was a giant called Pangu who used an axe to split heaven and earth. The earliest people were molded from mud by goddess Nuwa. There used to be 10 suns in the sky, and a master archer called Ho Yi shot down 9 of them with his bow. These stories were like the monkey with the stick, deeply attracting the naughty children. Today, the teacher was actually going to tell so many stories. To these naughty children, it was undoubtedly more joyous than the new year. When the young girl called Qin Qing heard the slow and magnetic voice, she turned her head and saw the naughty children's small faces that were focused on the story. Her heart seemed to be touched by something. These half-grown children were extremely mischievous and ran amok in the village. Who knew how much trouble they had caused her? At that moment, when she saw those innocent and extremely clear eyes, a seed was quietly planted in her heart. When she turned her head to look at Li Yi, she also longed for the day when she could be like this, loved and respected by these children. After a few stories were told, the naughty children still had expressions of reminiscence on their faces. Li Yi stood up and looked at them. From today onwards, Sister Qin will be teaching all of you in my place. You must be obedient like before. Don't bully her, understand? When the naughty children heard this, their expressions froze. Then they suddenly looked at Li Yi and looked a little flustered. Is the teacher leaving? Why is the teacher leaving? Did we make the teacher angry? Teacher, don't go. We will definitely be obedient. The naughty children were of different ages. The oldest was a little over 10 years old, while the youngest was only 7 or 8. When they heard that Li Yi was leaving, they all looked flustered. Seeing the naughty children suddenly become abnormally agitated, Li Yi felt a little warm in his heart. Even though these children were a little mischievous, they were still innocent children. After interacting with them for the past few days, it was naturally impossible to say that he didn't have any feelings for them. However, he couldn't be the teacher here for the rest of his life. He would have to leave sooner or later. This moment would come sooner or later. Li stretched out his hand and pressed down. The naughty children's voices gradually became softer, but they still looked at him with expectant eyes. Lu Xiaohu. Li opened his mouth and called out a name. The naughty child with the sturdiest physique immediately stood up from his seat. I'll leave the task of protecting Mr. Qin to you. Can you complete it? Lu Xiaohu's face revealed a serious expression. He suddenly patted his chest. Don't worry, sir. I guarantee that I will complete the task. If anyone dares to bully Mr. Qin, I will beat him up. Hello, Mr. Qin. Seeing the naughty children standing neatly and respectfully saluting her as a disciple, the young girl's heart finally relaxed. After walking out of the classroom, Li Yi turned to look at the young girl and said with a smile, I'll leave these children to you from now on. The teacher's allowance is 1 silver tael per month. When the time comes, I'll have Xiao Huan send it to you. The young girl was stunned for a moment. After regaining her senses, she hurriedly said, Absolutely not. I don't want any allowance. Besides, the teacher in the classroom has never. From now on, there will be. Li Yi waved his hand. Without waiting for her to finish, he smiled and left. The young girl stared at his back in a daze. She couldn't calm down. After a long time, she sighed and turned to walk back into the classroom. Chapter 106. It was the right decision to hand over the construction of the workshop to Fang. In just 5 days, a workshop that Li Yi was extremely satisfied with was completed. When it came to building houses, the men in the stockade were all experts. Even the houses that they were currently living in were built by them. Now that the workshop was completed, they only needed to purchase the raw materials before they could start producing a new batch of ruidu. Before this, Li Yi had spent all the money he had saved from renting the shop on renovating the shop. The floor was paved with wooden flooring, and the counters, tables, and chairs were all new and custom-made. On the walls around the counters, Li Yi had personally drawn a few landscape paintings. Of course, they were all 3D, and they were so lifelike that one would feel as if their eyes were about to sink into them. If someone were to walk into the shop, they would probably be stunned by these paintings at first glance. Since they had decided to go for the high-end route from the beginning, they could not be frugal in these areas. Even the porcelain bottles that contained the ruidu were very exquisite, and they had cost a lot of money when they were purchased. Seeing the money being spent like water, Fang often showed a pained expression on his face. If this business were to fail, his dream of having a beautiful wife and a big house would never come true. It was very likely that he would have to return to 2 months ago and continue to live a life of eating dirt. After all, he had a share of the shares of ruidu. Although he did not know what the shares were, Fang could still understand why his son-in-law said that he would have a share of the profits from ruidu. Son-in-law, have you thought about the name of the shop? Fang knew that he was not good at making money, so he changed the topic. I still need to think about it. Li Yi shook his head and said, the name of the shop was the signboard. Once it was decided, it could not be changed, and the decision could not be made easily. Now, all the preparations were in place, and everything was ready. All that was missing was the name of the shop. Why don't we call it 6 Gods Workshop? Li Yi raised his head and wanted to ask for everyone's opinion. Fang's face darkened. He couldn't understand why his son-in-law would fall in love with the name 6 Gods. The young maidservant stood beside Li Yi and saw second young miss giving her a look. She immediately said, Son-in-law, I think it sounds better to call it Rui Fang. Rui Square. Li Yi looked at Lu Rui. This matter clearly had nothing to do with her. Why did she have to take advantage of him every time? If Rui's became popular in the Jing Kingdom in the future, and every major city had a Rui's store, would people think of Lu Rui or him? No, this was a huge loss. Li Yi felt that it was better to call it 6 Spirits Lane. For the sake of her being his sister-in-law, he had already given her a lot of face by naming the floral water in this world as Rui's dew. This time, he was determined not to give in. Rui Fong. Fong muttered the name, shook his head and said, "This name is not very good. We are doing serious business. Rui Fong, Rui Fong. It sounds like a new brothel in the prefecture." Li Yi was keenly aware that as Fong spoke, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly became subtle. Clang! This was the sound of a sword being unsheathed. Feeling the two cold eyes behind him, Fong couldn't help but shiver, and cold sweat rolled down his forehead. It was only at this moment that he realized why he had a bad feeling when he spoke just now. He straightened his chest, and his expression became solemn. He looked at Li Yi seriously and said, "Young master, I suddenly feel that the name Rui Fong is very good. Since we are selling Rui's dew, the name of the store should naturally match it. I think there is no more suitable name than Rui Fong." Li Yi couldn't help but sigh in his heart as he looked at the righteous Lao Fong. How did that resolute man from back then turn into such a person? "I also think that it's better to call it Rui Fong," Lu Rui said with a smile. Although the name of the store was ultimately up to Li Yi, the public opinion was obviously on Lu Rui's side. Li Yi couldn't be arbitrary. He looked up at them and said, "Are you really not going to consider Six Spirits Lane?" In order to fully promote democracy, the name of the store was decided. On the same day, he and Fong ordered a signboard in the prefecture city. In order to further enhance the store's prestige, Li Yi found all of Wang Shiji's calligraphy in the library. After digesting them, he found the three words Ru, Yi, and Fong, and wrote them out personally. Of course, even if he had such a heaven-defying cheating device, he only needed to copy it. He wouldn't be able to reach Wang Shiji's level, but being able to copy 80 to 90% of it was enough to shock many people. At least, the shopkeeper who made the signboard was shocked by the elegant semi-cursive script. He had been running this ancestral shop for several decades and had made countless plaques. He had seen many authentic works of famous masters. Under the influence of what he had seen and heard, even though the shopkeeper's calligraphy skills were not very profound, few people could compare to him in terms of his ability to appreciate calligraphy. It was just 3 words, but it was enough to show that the calligraphy skills of the person who wrote it were profound. Without decades of practice, it would be impossible to achieve this. This level of skill could probably be compared with several calligraphy masters in the world. However, which one of those people didn't have decades of accumulation in order to achieve what they had today? If the scholar hadn't written in front of him, he definitely wouldn't believe that such wonderful calligraphy could be written by such a young man. Li Yi wasn't surprised by the shopkeeper's shocked expression. That was the sage of calligraphy, Wang Shiji, who had influenced Chinese calligraphy for more than 2,000 years. How could his calligraphy be ordinary? Of course, Li Yi was still very happy that the shopkeeper insisted on not taking his money. Now was the time for his career to start, so he should save as much as possible. The sage of calligraphy really deserved his reputation. Looking at the shopkeeper holding the piece of paper as if it was a treasure, Li Yi couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The opening of the new store was supposed to do some publicity and marketing, but Li Yi wasn't in a hurry to do that. He still had some confidence in Rui Lu. However, this confidence was shaken on the first day of the store's opening. After half a day, not even a bottle of Rui Lu was sold. A few people entered the store to take a look, but when they heard that such a small bottle of Rui Lu was sold for 1 tael of silver, they immediately left as if they were escaping before Li Yi introduced the function of Rui Lu. Could it be that I set the price too high? After half a day, even Li Yi began to doubt it. 1 tael of silver was not a small amount for most people in the prefecture. Although they could afford it, they wouldn't be so extravagant as to buy such a bottle of something they didn't know the function of. Where are the local tycoons? Li Yi sat behind the counter and saw that there were only him and the young maidservant in the entire store. He couldn't help but start to call out in his heart. The young maidservant sat by the table with one hand supporting her chin. She looked out of the door and watched the passers-by with boredom. At a certain moment, 2 figures stopped in front of the door for a moment and then walked in. The young maidservant came back to her senses and immediately stood up from the chair and ran over. "Ladies, welcome to Rui Workshop. She bowed and said with a clear voice, "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."